the Goths themselves preserved stories of their origins. These tales were passed down through countless generations around flickering fires in great wooden halls. The 6th century historian Jordanes wrote down these legends in his work called the Getica. According to these ancient stories, the Goths came from a great island in the far north called Skansa. Modern scholars believe this refers to the Scandinavian peninsula, though the ancient Goths thought of it as an island because they did not know how far the land extended. Jordanes tells us that Skansa was like a great womb of nations. Many different peoples emerged from this frozen northern land and spread across Europe. The Goths were among the most important of these migrating tribes. According to legend, they left their homeland under the leadership of a king named Berig. They crossed the sea in just 3 ships and landed on the southern shore of the Baltic Sea. This new land they called Gothiskansa, meaning the landing place of the Goths. Now we must pause here and consider what we truly know versus what is legend. Modern archaeology has given us some fascinating clues. In the region of northern Poland, near the mouth of the Vistula River, archaeologists have discovered a distinct culture. They call this the wheelbark culture. It flourished from around the 1st century before the Common Era until the 3rd century of the Common Era. The burial practices and artifacts of this culture match well with what we would expect from early Gothic peoples. The wheelbark culture shows us a people who cremated some of their dead and buried others. They placed weapons and jewellery in the graves of important individuals. They built stone circles and raised mounds over their most honoured leaders. These were not primitive savages living in crude huts. They were skilled craftspeople who worked bronze and iron. They traded with distant lands and developed their own artistic styles. But let us return to the legends, for they tell us much about how the Goths saw themselves. After landing at Gothiskansa, the people began to multiply and spread across the land. According to Jordanes, the 5th king after Berig was a ruler named Philima. It was Philima who led the Goths on their great migration southward. The population had grown too large for their lands to support. They needed new territories, new farmland, new pastures for their cattle and horses. Philima gathered his people and began the long journey toward the Black Sea. This was no small undertaking. Imagine entire communities on the move. Men, women and children, elderly grandparents and newborn babies, cattle and sheep and horses, wagons loaded with all their possessions, thousands upon thousands of people travelling across hundreds of miles of unknown territory. They crossed great rivers and dense forests. They passed through the lands of other tribes, sometimes peacefully and sometimes through conflict. The journey took many years, perhaps even generations. Along the way, the Goths encountered many other peoples. Some joined them on their migration. Others fought against them and were defeated. Still others simply moved aside and let the great host pass through their territories. The Goths were becoming something more than just a single tribe. They were becoming a confederation of peoples united under Gothic leadership. One strange legend from this migration period deserves mention. Jordanes tells us of certain women among the Goths who were accused of practicing witchcraft. King Philima drove these women out into the wilderness, far from the main body of the people. These exiled witches, the story goes, mated with evil spirits in the wasteland. From these unions came a terrible race called the Huns. Now this is certainly not historical fact. The Huns had their own origins in the steppes of Central Asia. But this legend shows us how the Goths later tried to explain the terrifying Hunnic invasions that would eventually shatter their world. The migration continued until the Goths reached a land called Oyum. Scholars believe this refers to the region north of the Black Sea in what is now Ukraine. Here the Goths found rich grasslands perfect for their herds. They found rivers teeming with fish. They found forests full of game. And most importantly, they found themselves on the edge of the civilized world. To the south lay the wealthy cities of the Greek colonies along the Black Sea coast. Beyond that lay the mighty Roman Empire itself. The Goths had arrived at a crossroads of history. They stood between the world of the northern barbarians and the world of Mediterranean civilization. This position would shape everything that followed. The Goths would learn from the Romans and Greeks. They would trade with them and fight against them. They would eventually bring down the Western Empire and build kingdoms on its ruins. But all of that lay far in the future. For now, in those early centuries, the Goths established themselves in their new homeland. They built settlements and farmed the rich black earth. They raised cattle and horses on the vast grasslands. They developed trade relationships with the Greek cities along the coast. Roman coins and luxury goods flowed northward. Gothic grain, hides, and slaves flowed southward. The Goths were becoming wealthy and powerful. During this period, Gothic society began to take on its characteristic form. At the top stood the kings and nobles. These were the great warriors who led in battle and judged disputes in times of peace. Below them came the free farmers and craftsmen who formed the bulk of the population. At the bottom were the slaves, many of them captured in raids on neighbouring peoples. This was a society built for war, but also capable of peace and prosperity. The Goths worshipped the old Germanic gods. They honoured Tiwaz, the god of war and justice. They made sacrifices to Wodanaz, the All-Father who gathered fallen warriors to his hall. They celebrated the fertility goddess Frigga and the thunder god Thunras. Their priests performed rituals in sacred groves and beside holy springs. They read omens in the flight of birds and the patterns of cast lots. Religion was woven into every aspect of Gothic life. Before battle, the warriors would consult the gods through divination. After victory, they would offer thanksgiving sacrifices. The changing seasons brought their own festivals and ceremonies. The dead were honoured with elaborate funeral rites. The Goths believed in an afterlife where brave warriors would feast forever in the halls of the gods. The early Goths also developed their own system of writing. This was the runic alphabet, shared with other Germanic peoples. The runes were not just letters for writing ordinary messages. They were believed to hold magical power. The very word rune means secret or mystery. Skilled practitioners could use the runes for divination, for blessing, and for cursing. Runes were carved on weapons to make them strike true. They were carved on amulets to protect the wearer from harm. As the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era passed, the Goths grew ever stronger. They absorbed neighbouring peoples and expanded their territory. They learned new techniques of warfare from their contact with Rome. They acquired Roman weapons and armour through trade and raid alike. The small tribe that had crossed the Baltic in 3 ships was becoming a major power on the European stage. The Romans began to take notice of these newcomers on their northern frontier. Roman writers started to mention the Goths in their histories and geographies. At first, the references are brief and vague. The Romans had many barbarian peoples to worry about, and the Goths were just one among many. But as Gothic power grew, so did Roman attention and concern. By the middle of the 3rd century, the Goths had become a serious threat to Roman security. They began launching major raids across the Danube River into Roman territory. These were not just quick raids for plunder. They were large-scale invasions involving tens of thousands of warriors. The Goths struck deep into the Balkans, reaching as far as Greece itself. They even took to the sea, launching naval expeditions that ravaged the coasts of the Black Sea and the Aegean. The crisis of the 3rd century had begun, and the Goths were at the heart of it. The Roman Empire, which had seemed invincible for so long, was suddenly struggling to survive. Emperors rose and fell with dizzying speed. Civil wars tore the empire apart from within, while barbarians attacked from without. And among all the barbarian peoples threatening Rome, none were more dangerous than the Goths. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we explore the great wars between Goths and Romans, we must first understand how the Gothic people themselves changed and divided during their time north of the Black Sea. For it was during this period that the Goths split into 2 great branches. These were the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths, whose separate destinies would shape the future of Europe. The journey of the Goths from their northern homeland to the shores of the Black Sea stands as one of the great migrations in human history. This was not a single dramatic march, but rather a slow movement spanning many generations. Let us examine this epic journey in greater detail, for it transformed the Goths from a minor northern tribe into a major force in European history. The lands the Goths left behind in Scandinavia were harsh but not without their own beauty. Dense forests of pine and birch covered the hills. Cold, clear lakes dotted the landscape. The soil was thin and rocky in many places, making farming difficult. The growing season was short, limited by the long dark winters. These conditions created a hardy people, tough and resourceful, accustomed to struggle and hardship. The decision to migrate was likely driven by several factors working together. Population growth put pressure on limited agricultural land. Climate changes may have made farming even more difficult. The lure of richer lands to the south drew the ambitious and adventurous, and once the migration began, it developed its own momentum. Success bred more success, as each new territory conquered, opened paths to further expansion. The first stage of the migration brought the Goths across the Baltic Sea to the southern shore. This crossing was no small matter for a people without sophisticated naval technology. The Baltic can be treacherous, with sudden storms and strong currents. Yet the Goths managed the crossing, probably in stages island hopping from Scandinavia to the mainland. The legend of 3 ships carrying the entire people is surely an exaggeration, but it preserves the memory of a sea crossing. Once on the southern shore of the Baltic, the Goths found themselves in a very different landscape. The coastal regions were flat and marshy in places, but further inland lay rich farmland. The great Vistula River provided a natural highway into the interior. The Goths followed this river and its tributaries, spreading across what is now northern Poland. Archaeological evidence from the wheelbark culture shows us how the Goths lived during this period. Their settlements were small villages of wooden houses. They practiced mixed farming, growing grain and raising livestock. They buried their dead with grave goods that tell us much about their society. Wealthy individuals received elaborate burials with jewellery, weapons, and imported goods. Poorer folk received simpler treatment, but were still honoured with proper funeral rites. The Goths were not alone in this region. Other Germanic peoples lived nearby, and the Goths had to establish relationships with them. Sometimes these relationships were peaceful, based on trade and intermarriage. Other times they were hostile, marked by raids and warfare. The Goths proved adept at both diplomacy and combat. They made allies when it suited them, and crushed enemies when necessary. During the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, the Goths consolidated their position in the Vistula region. They grew in numbers and in strength. They developed more sophisticated social structures and more effective military organisation. They established trade connections that brought Roman goods hundreds of miles from the imperial frontier. Roman coins, glassware, and bronze vessels have been found in Gothic graves from this period. But the Goths did not remain static. The pressure of population growth and the attraction of even richer lands continued to push them southward. Sometime around the late 2nd century, the Great Migration resumed. The Goths began moving toward the southeast, following the river valleys that led toward the Black Sea. This phase of the migration took the Goths through the vast forests and plains of what is now Ukraine. They crossed the lands of many other peoples along the way. Some of these peoples were absorbed into the Gothic Confederation. Others were pushed aside or subjugated. The Goths were not just migrating, they were conquering and expanding. The terrain they crossed was varied and challenging. Dense forests gave way to open steppes. Rivers had to be forded or crossed by boat. Marshlands had to be navigated carefully. The Goths learned to adapt to each new environment they encountered. They became expert horsemen on the open plains. They learned the ways of the steppe nomads who had lived in these lands for centuries. By the early 3rd century, the Goths had reached the northwestern shores of the Black Sea. This was a pivotal moment in their history. They had arrived at the edge of the civilized world. To the south lay the wealthy Greek colonies that had been founded centuries earlier. Cities like Olbia, Tyrus, and Chersonesus dotted the coastline. These cities were centres of trade and culture, connected by sea routes to the wider Mediterranean world. The Goths were fascinated by these cities and the wealth they contained. They had never seen such things before. Stone buildings, paved streets, temples and theatres. Goods from all corners of the known world. Educated people who could read and write, who knew philosophy and medicine and mathematics. The contrast with Gothic village life must have been striking indeed. At first, the relationship between Goths and Greeks was primarily commercial. The Goths had things the Greeks wanted: grain, cattle, hides, furs, and slaves. The Greeks had things the Goths wanted: wine, olive oil, fine textiles, metalwork, and jewellery. Trade flourished, and both sides benefited. Gothic chiefs grew wealthy from this commerce and used their wealth to enhance their power and prestige. But the relationship was never entirely peaceful. The Goths were warriors, and raiding was part of their culture. The wealthy Greek cities were tempting targets. Gothic warbands began launching attacks on the coastal settlements. Sometimes these were small-scale raids for plunder. Other times they were larger expeditions aimed at extracting tribute or capturing slaves. The Greek cities had long experience dealing with barbarian neighbours. They built walls and maintained garrisons. They paid tribute when necessary and fought back when they could. They played different barbarian groups against each other through clever diplomacy, but the Goths were a more formidable threat than most. Their numbers were greater, their organisation was better, and their ambitions were larger. The region north of the Black Sea where the Goths settled was called Scythia by ancient writers. This name recalled the earlier inhabitants of the region, the Scythians, who had been famous throughout the ancient world for their horsemanship and their gold. The Scythians had faded away centuries before the Goths arrived, but their memory lingered in the name of the land. The landscape of this region suited the Goths well. The steppes provided excellent grazing for their horses and cattle. The river valleys offered fertile soil for farming. The forests supplied timber for building and fuel for fires. The climate was milder than Scandinavia, with longer growing seasons and shorter winters. The Goths prospered in their new homeland. As they settled into this region, the Goths began to change. Contact with Greek and Roman civilization introduced new ideas and new technologies. Gothic craftsmen learned new techniques from their southern neighbours. Gothic warriors acquired better weapons and armour. Gothic leaders began to adopt some of the trappings of Roman power. They wore Roman-style jewellery and drank wine from Roman cups. But the Goths did not simply become imitation Romans. They maintained their own identity, their own language, their own customs. They adapted what they found useful from other cultures while keeping what was essential to themselves. This ability to learn and adapt while remaining distinctly Gothic would serve them well in the centuries to come. The settlement period also saw the emergence of distinct Gothic subgroups. The Goths who settled closer to the Black Sea coast had more contact with Greek and Roman civilization. Those who remained further north and east retained more of their traditional ways. Geographic separation began to create cultural differences. The seeds of the later division between Visigoths and Ostrogoths were being planted during this period. The 3rd century brought dramatic changes. The Roman Empire entered a period of crisis. Civil wars, economic troubles, and barbarian invasions threatened to tear the empire apart. The Goths saw opportunity in Roman weakness. They began launching major raids across the Danube into Roman territory. These raids brought them into direct conflict with the empire for the first time. The first major Gothic raid into Roman territory occurred around 238 of the Common Era. Gothic warriors crossed the Danube and attacked the city of Histria on the western coast of the Black Sea. The Romans paid them to go away, a practice that would become all too common in the following decades. The Goths had learned that Rome could be intimidated, that its wealth could be extracted through force. More raids followed in the years after. In 250, a massive Gothic army crossed the Danube under the leadership of a king named Neva. This was no mere raiding party, but a full-scale invasion. The Goths penetrated deep into Roman territory, besieging cities and devastating the countryside. The Roman Emperor Decius marched to meet them with his army. The resulting campaign was a disaster for Rome. In 251, at the Battle of Abratus, the Gothic army destroyed the Roman force. Emperor Decius himself was killed, becoming the first Roman emperor to die in battle against a foreign enemy. This was a shocking event that reverberated throughout the empire. If even the emperor could fall to barbarian swords, was anywhere safe? The Goths followed up their victory with more raids. They took to the sea, building or capturing ships and launching naval expeditions around the Black Sea. Gothic fleets ravaged the coasts of Asia Minor and even reached as far as Greece. The great city of Athens itself was attacked, though it survived. The ancient temple at Ephesus, one of the wonders of the world, was burned by Gothic raiders. These decades of raiding brought enormous wealth back to the Gothic homeland. Roman gold and silver, fine goods and slaves, all flowed northward. Gothic society was transformed by this influx of wealth. The gap between rich and poor widened. Powerful kings emerged who could command large followings through their ability to distribute plunder. A warrior aristocracy developed that measured status in terms of military success, but the raids also brought changes of another kind. The Goths captured many Romans during their expeditions. Some of these captives were sold as slaves. Others were kept in Gothic territory, where they lived and worked among their captors. These Roman prisoners brought their skills and knowledge with them. Craftsmen taught Gothic apprentices. Farmers introduced new agricultural techniques, and Christian missionaries began to spread their faith among the Gothic people. The late 3rd century saw the Roman Empire begin to recover from its crisis. A series of strong emperors restored order and pushed back against the barbarians. The Emperor Aurelian defeated Gothic forces and recovered territory that had been lost. The Emperor Diocletian reorganized the empire and strengthened its defences. The frontier along the Danube was fortified and garrisoned. The Goths found themselves facing a revitalized Roman Empire. The easy raiding of earlier decades became more difficult. Roman armies were better organized and better led. Roman fortifications were stronger. The Goths had to adapt to these new conditions. Some Gothic groups made peace with Rome and became allies or mercenaries. Others continued to resist and raid when opportunity allowed. By the early 4th century, the Goths had been living in the Black Sea region for over a century. They had transformed from migrating tribes into settled kingdoms. They had learned much from their contact with Rome and Greece. They had developed sophisticated political structures and military capabilities. They were poised to play an even larger role in the history of the ancient world. The stage was set for the next great chapter in Gothic history. The conversion to Christianity would transform Gothic culture. The division into Visigoths and Ostrogoths would create two distinct peoples with two distinct destinies. And the coming of the Huns would shatter the Gothic world and send the survivors flooding into the Roman Empire. But all of that lay ahead. For now, the Goths enjoyed their position as masters of the lands north of the Black Sea, wealthy and powerful and confident in their strength. The Gothic people did not remain united forever. Over time, they separated into two great branches that would follow very different paths through history. These were the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths, names that have echoed down through the centuries. Understanding how and why this division occurred is essential to understanding the later history of the Gothic peoples. The names themselves give us some clues. Visigoths is often interpreted as meaning the Western Goths, while Ostrogoths means the Eastern Goths. This geographic interpretation makes sense given where these groups eventually settled. The Visigoths moved westward into Gaul and Spain. The Ostrogoths remained in the east before eventually conquering Italy. But the origins of these names may be more complex than simple geography. Some scholars believe that Visigoths originally meant the noble Goths, or the good Goths, derived from a Gothic word meaning worthy or good. The Ostrogoths may have been the Goths of the rising sun, or the shining Goths. These interpretations suggest that the division was based on more than just location. It may have reflected different claims to prestige and legitimacy within Gothic society. Whatever the original meanings of the names, the division itself was real and significant. It developed gradually during the 3rd and 4th centuries as the Goths spread across a vast territory. Geographic separation led to political separation. Different groups developed their own leadership structures, their own traditions, their own identities. What had been one people became two. The Visigoths came to dominate the western portions of Gothic territory, closer to the Roman frontier along the Danube. They had more frequent contact with the Roman Empire, both peaceful and hostile. They were more influenced by Roman culture and more involved in Roman affairs. Their kings negotiated treaties with Roman emperors. Their warriors served as mercenaries in Roman armies. Their merchants traded in Roman markets. The Ostrogoths held the eastern territories, stretching toward the Don River and the steppes beyond. They had more contact with the nomadic peoples of the east, the Alans and Huns and other steppe warriors. They adopted more of the horse-centered culture of the steppes. They remained somewhat more traditional in their customs and beliefs. They were further from Roman influence and more independent of Roman power. The 4th century saw both groups develop powerful kingdoms under strong rulers. Among the Visigoths, a dynasty known as the Balthi rose to prominence. The name Balthi meant the bold ones, and these kings lived up to their name. They led their people in war and peace, judging disputes, leading armies, and negotiating with foreign powers. The Balthi would produce some of the most famous Gothic kings in history. Among the Ostrogoths, the Amal dynasty held similar power. The Amals claimed descent from divine ancestors and semi-legendary heroes. Their genealogies, preserved by later writers, stretched back through generations of kings to the gods themselves. Whether these genealogies were historically accurate mattered less than what they represented. A claim to sacred kingship, a right to rule based on blood and divine favour. The two groups were not entirely separate. They shared a common language, though regional dialects may have developed. They shared common religious beliefs, worshipping the same gods and following the same rituals. They recognized their kinship and sometimes cooperated against common enemies. Intermarriage between noble families maintained connections across the divide, but they were increasingly distinct peoples with distinct interests. During the 4th century, a momentous change came to the Gothic world. Christianity began to spread among the Gothic people. This was not a sudden conversion, but a gradual process that took many decades. It began with Roman captives who maintained their faith in Gothic lands. It continued with missionaries who travelled north to preach to the barbarians. And it culminated with the work of one remarkable man, Ulfilas. Ulfilas was born around 311 of the Common Era. His family had been captured by Gothic raiders and brought to live among the Goths. Though living in Gothic territory, they maintained their Christian faith. Ulfilas grew up speaking both Gothic and Greek, educated in both cultures. He was ordained as a bishop and sent back to the Goths as a missionary. The form of Christianity that Ulfilas brought to the Goths was Arianism. This was a version of the faith that differed from what would become Orthodox Catholic Christianity. The main difference concerned the nature of Christ. Arians believed that Christ was created by God the Father and was therefore subordinate to him. Orthodox Christians believed that Christ was co-equal and co-eternal with the Father. This may seem like a subtle theological distinction, but it had enormous consequences. Ulfilas preached among the Goths for many years, winning many converts. To help spread the faith, he undertook an extraordinary project. He translated the Bible into the Gothic language. This was the first time that any Germanic language had been written down in a systematic way. To accomplish this task, Ulfilas had to create a new alphabet, adapted from Greek letters, but modified to represent Gothic sounds. The Gothic Bible of Ulfilas was a landmark achievement. It gave the Goths access to Christian scripture in their own language. It created a written form of Gothic that could be used for other purposes as well. It demonstrated that Gothic was a language worthy of serious literature, not just a barbarian tongue. Fragments of this translation survive to this day, precious witnesses to the Gothic language and to Ulfilas's remarkable work. The conversion to Christianity did not happen all at once. Many Goths clung to the old gods for generations. The traditional religion was deeply woven into Gothic culture, connected to warfare, kingship, and daily life. Abandoning the old gods meant abandoning much of what made the Goths who they were. Some Gothic leaders actively resisted Christianity, persecuting converts and driving out missionaries. But Christianity offered things that the old religion did not. It offered a coherent theology, a written scripture, an organized priesthood. It offered connection to the wider Christian world, including the mighty Roman Empire. It offered hope of salvation and eternal life. Gradually, more and more Goths accepted the new faith. By the late 4th century, Christianity had become the dominant religion among both Visigoths and Ostrogoths. The Arian form of Christianity that the Goths adopted would have lasting consequences. When the Goths later established kingdoms within the former Roman Empire, their Arianism set them apart from their Catholic subjects. Religious difference reinforced ethnic difference. Goths and Romans worshipped the same God but in different ways, attended different churches, followed different clergy. This religious divide would complicate Gothic rule and eventually contribute to the fall of the Gothic kingdoms. The 4th century also saw the Goths reach the height of their power in the Black Sea region. The Ostrogothic king Ermanaric built a vast empire that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Ancient sources describe him as ruling over many different peoples, not just Goths but also Slavs, Balts and others. His kingdom was the largest Gothic political unit ever created. Ermanaric was remembered as a great warrior and a harsh ruler. Legends grew up around him, some historical and some fantastic. He was said to have conquered countless enemies and accumulated vast treasures. He was also said to have been cruel and tyrannical, punishing disloyalty with terrible severity. One famous story tells how he had a woman named Sunilda torn apart by horses because her husband had betrayed him. The Visigothic kingdom to the west was smaller but still powerful. It was more directly involved with the Roman Empire, sometimes as enemy and sometimes as ally. Visigothic warriors served in Roman armies and learned Roman military techniques. Visigothic leaders negotiated with Roman emperors and received Roman subsidies. The relationship was complex and ever-changing, marked by periods of war and periods of peace. Both Gothic kingdoms developed sophisticated political and social structures during this period. Below the kings stood a nobility of powerful warriors who commanded their own followers. These nobles met in assemblies to advise the king and make important decisions. Below the nobility came the free farmers and craftsmen who formed the bulk of the population. At the bottom were slaves and conquered peoples who worked the land and served their masters. Gothic law during this period was based on custom and tradition. There was no written law code. Instead, legal knowledge was preserved in the memories of elders and judges. Disputes were settled through a combination of negotiation, compensation, and ordeal. A person accused of a crime might prove innocence by swearing an oath supported by oath helpers, or by undergoing a physical test believed to reveal divine judgment. Warfare remained central to Gothic culture. Young men proved themselves through military service. Leaders gained followers through success in battle. Wealth flowed from raiding and conquest. The Goths developed effective military tactics that combined infantry and cavalry. They learned to use the bow from their steppe neighbours. They adopted Roman weapons and armour when they could get them. The Gothic warrior was expected to be brave, loyal, and generous. Cowardice in battle was the worst possible disgrace. A warrior who fled from the enemy might be killed by his own people. Loyalty to one's lord was paramount. To betray a lord was to commit an unforgivable crime, and a successful warrior was expected to share his plunder with his followers, binding them to him through gifts and feasts. Women in Gothic society had defined roles, but were not without power. Noble women managed households and controlled considerable property. They could inherit land and goods from their fathers and husbands. Some women achieved fame as wise counsellors or even as warriors. The legendary Gothic women who supposedly gave birth to the Huns reflect a belief that women could possess dangerous supernatural powers. By the 370s of the Common Era, the Gothic world seemed secure. The Visigoths and Ostrogoths had established themselves as major powers. They had converted to Christianity and developed written literature. They had built effective political institutions and military forces. They traded with Rome and sometimes fought with Rome, but they were not subject to Rome. They were free peoples, masters of their own destinies. Then the Huns came, and everything changed. To truly understand the Goths, we must look beyond battles and migrations to examine how they lived their daily lives. What did a Gothic village look like? How did Gothic families function? What did the Goths believe about the gods and the afterlife? These questions take us deep into the heart of Gothic civilization. The basic unit of Gothic society was the household. This typically consisted of an extended family living together under one roof. A household might include grandparents, parents, children, and sometimes unmarried aunts and uncles. Slaves and servants also lived within the household, working alongside family members. The head of the household, usually the oldest capable male, held authority over everyone within it. Gothic houses were built of wood and thatch. In the northern regions, they were often longhouses, rectangular structures that could be quite large. A single longhouse might be 60 feet long or more, with space for the family, their animals, and their stored goods. A central hearth provided warmth and light, with smoke escaping through a hole in the roof. The floor was packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes or straw. In the southern regions near the Black Sea, Gothic architecture showed more variety. Contact with Greek and Roman civilization introduced new building techniques. Some wealthy Goths built houses of stone or brick. They adopted Roman-style furnishings and decorations. But even in these more sophisticated dwellings, the basic pattern of extended family living remained. Villages consisted of clusters of houses, usually belonging to related families. A typical village might have 10 to 30 households, giving a population of perhaps 100 to 300 people. Villages were often located near water sources, along rivers or beside springs. Good farmland and pasture were essential. Defensive considerations also mattered. Villages on hilltops or in easily defended positions were common. The land around a village was worked communally, in some respects and individually in others. Pastures for grazing animals were often shared among all the village households. Forests were common resources where anyone could hunt and gather. But farmland was typically divided among families, with each household responsible for its own fields. The best land went to the most powerful families. Farming was the foundation of Gothic economy. The Goths grew wheat, barley, oats and rye. They cultivated vegetables and gathered wild fruits and nuts. Their farming techniques were relatively simple compared to Roman agriculture, but effective enough to support their population. They used wooden ploughs drawn by oxen to break the soil. They harvested with iron sickles and stored grain in pits or raised granaries. Animal husbandry was equally important. The Goths raised cattle for meat, milk and leather. They kept sheep for wool and goats for milk and meat. Pigs roamed the forests, fattening on acorns and beech nuts before being slaughtered in autumn. Chickens and geese provided eggs and feathers. Every household kept animals, and wealth was often measured in the size of one's herds. Horses held a special place in Gothic society. They were not just working animals, but symbols of status and power. A Gothic warrior without a horse was incomplete. The best horses were bred carefully and trained for war. They learned to respond to their riders' commands in the chaos of battle. A good war horse was worth more than most men could earn in years of labour. Chiefs and kings maintained large herds of horses, lending them to favoured warriors and using them as gifts to secure loyalty. The Goths were skilled craftspeople who produced everything their society needed. Blacksmiths forged weapons and tools from iron. They made swords and spears, axes and knives, ploughshares and sickles. The smith was a respected figure in Gothic society, almost magical in his ability to transform raw metal into useful objects. Smiths often held special status and were sometimes believed to possess supernatural powers. Woodworkers built houses, wagons, boats and furniture. They carved elaborate decorations on important objects. They made the shields that warriors carried into battle and the chests that held family treasures. Wood was abundant in Gothic lands, and the Goths learned to work it with great skill. Some of their wooden objects were true works of art, decorated with intricate patterns and symbolic designs. Textile production was primarily women's work. Gothic women spun wool and flax into thread using drop spindles. They wove cloth on upright looms, creating fabrics for clothing, blankets, and other household needs. The most skilled weavers produced elaborate patterns using different coloured threads. Fine textiles were valuable trade goods and important markers of status. A woman's skill at weaving brought honour to her household. Leatherworking was another essential craft. The Goths made shoes, belts, bags and harnesses from animal hides. They tanned leather using traditional methods involving bark and other natural materials. Leather armour provided protection for warriors who could not afford metal. Leather was also used for writing surfaces before the Goths adopted parchment from the Romans. Pottery was made locally in most Gothic communities. Gothic pottery was functional rather than decorative, designed for cooking, storage and serving food. The Goths did not use potter's wheels in their early history, instead shaping vessels by hand. Their pottery was simple but effective, fired in open bonfires rather than specialised kilns. Over time, contact with Roman civilization introduced more sophisticated pottery techniques. Jewellery making reached high levels of sophistication among the Goths. Gothic goldsmiths and silversmiths created beautiful objects that combined Germanic traditions with influences from Rome and the steppes. They used techniques like filigree, where thin wires of precious metal are twisted into intricate patterns. They used cloisonné, where small compartments are filled with coloured glass or gemstones. Gothic jewellery often featured animal motifs, especially eagles, horses and serpents. The famous Gothic fibulae deserve special mention. These were elaborate brooches used to fasten cloaks and other garments. They ranged from simple functional pins to magnificent works of art encrusted with gems. A fine fibula was a statement of wealth and status. Gothic nobles competed to display the most impressive jewellery, and skilled jewellers were highly valued. Trade connected Gothic communities to each other and to the wider world. Local trade brought goods from village to village within Gothic territory. Farmers exchanged grain for metalwork. Herders traded animals for cloth. Specialised craftspeople sold their products throughout the region. Markets and fairs brought people together for trade and social interaction. Long-distance trade connected the Goths to distant lands. Amber from the Baltic coast was highly prized throughout the ancient world. The Goths controlled much of the amber trade, sending this golden fossil resin southward to Roman and Greek markets. In return, they received wine, olive oil, fine pottery, glassware, and metalwork. Roman coins, circulated in Gothic territory, used both as currency and as raw material for jewellery. The slave trade was another important economic activity. The Goths captured slaves in their raids and wars, selling them to Roman merchants or keeping them for their own use. Slaves performed much of the hard labour in Gothic society. They worked in the fields, tended animals, and served in households. Some slaves were skilled craftspeople whose abilities made them valuable property. The slave trade was brutal but profitable, and it connected the Goths to the broader Mediterranean economy. Gothic social structure was hierarchical but not rigid. At the top stood the kings, who claimed descent from divine ancestors and ruled by a combination of inheritance and personal ability. Below the kings came the nobility, the great warriors who commanded their own followers and held large estates. The free farmers and craftspeople formed the middle of society, independent but owing obligations to their lords. At the bottom were the slaves and the conquered peoples who had lost their freedom. Mobility between these ranks was possible, though not common. A brave warrior could rise through military success, gaining followers and wealth until he joined the ranks of the nobility. A noble who failed in war or lost his wealth might sink into obscurity. Slaves could sometimes earn or buy their freedom, though this was rare. The system was flexible enough to reward ability while maintaining the basic social order. The family was the foundation of Gothic social organisation. Families were grouped into clans that traced descent from common ancestors. Clans were grouped into tribes, and tribes were grouped into the larger confederations that we call Visigoths and Ostrogoths. Each level of organisation had its own leaders and its own functions. Families handled daily affairs. Clans settled disputes among their members. Tribes organised for war and made decisions about migration. The confederations dealt with matters affecting all the Gothic people. Blood feuds were a constant feature of Gothic society. When one person killed another, the victim's family had the right to seek revenge. This could lead to cycles of killing that lasted for generations. To prevent endless bloodshed, the Goths developed systems of compensation. A killer could pay wergild, literally man price, to the victim's family. The amount varied depending on the victim's status. A noble was worth more than a commoner, a free person more than a slave. Accepting wergild ended the feud, at least in theory. Justice in Gothic society was administered through assemblies. Free men gathered to hear disputes and render judgments. The accused could defend themselves by swearing oaths, supported by oath helpers who vouched for their character. If oaths were not sufficient, the matter might be decided by ordeal. The accused might be required to hold a hot iron or plunge their hand into boiling water. If the wounds healed cleanly, innocence was proven. If they festered, guilt was established. The Goths believed that the gods would protect the innocent and punish the guilty. Religion permeated every aspect of Gothic life. The Goths worshipped a pantheon of gods similar to those of other Germanic peoples. At the head of this pantheon stood Wodanaz, known to later peoples as Odin or Wotan. He was the All-Father, the god of wisdom, war, and death. He had sacrificed one of his eyes to gain knowledge of the runes. He presided over the Hall of the Slain, where brave warriors feasted after death. Tiwaz was the god of war and justice, the divine judge who oversaw oaths and treaties. His name survives in our word, Tuesday. Warriors invoked him before battle, asking for victory and protection. He was also the god of the assembly, present when free men gathered to make laws and settle disputes. Oaths sworn in his name were especially sacred, and oath-breakers could expect his terrible punishment. Thunraz was the thunder god, wielder of the mighty hammer that produced lightning and thunder. He was the protector of ordinary people, the enemy of giants and monsters. Farmers prayed to him for rain to water their crops. Travellers asked his protection on dangerous journeys. His name survives in our word, Thursday. He was perhaps the most popular god among common folk, more approachable than the mysterious Wodanaz. Frigga was the great goddess, associated with love, fertility, and the home. Women prayed to her for healthy children and happy marriages. She was also connected to fate and prophecy, knowing the destinies of gods and men. Her name survives in our word, Friday. She was the wife of Wodanaz in some traditions, though the relationships among the gods were complex and varied. Many other gods and spirits populated the Gothic religious world. There were gods of the sun and moon, of rivers and forests, of crafts and skills. There were spirits that inhabited particular places, demanding respect from those who passed through. There were ancestors who watched over their descendants, requiring offerings and remembrance. The world was alive with supernatural beings, and the Goths navigated this world through ritual and sacrifice. Sacrifice was central to Gothic religion. The Goths offered animals to the gods, killing them in sacred rituals and sharing the meat in communal feasts. Horses were especially valuable sacrifices, offered on important occasions. Cattle, sheep, and pigs were more common offerings. The blood was sprinkled on altars and participants. The meat was cooked and eaten, with portions set aside for the gods. These sacrificial feasts bound communities together and maintained the relationship between humans and divine powers. Human sacrifice also occurred, though it was less common than animal sacrifice. Prisoners of war might be killed as offerings to the war gods. Criminals condemned to death might be sacrificed rather than simply executed. Some sources describe elaborate rituals in which victims were hanged, stabbed and drowned, combining multiple forms of death. These were solemn occasions, undertaken only when the stakes were highest. Sacred groves served as the primary places of worship. The Goths did not build temples in their early history. Instead, they gathered in forest clearings that were set apart for religious purposes. These groves were considered the dwelling places of the gods, too holy for ordinary activities. Trees within the groves were never cut. Animals that wandered in were protected. Humans entered only for religious purposes, approaching with reverence and leaving offerings. Priests and priestesses mediated between the human and divine worlds. They knew the proper rituals and the correct words to address the gods. They interpreted omens and performed divinations. They blessed warriors before battle and purified communities after disasters. Some priests were attached to particular sanctuaries. Others travelled from place to place, serving wherever they were needed. The priesthood was a respected calling, though not a separate caste as in some other cultures. Divination played an important role in Gothic decision-making. Before any major undertaking, the Goths sought to know the will of the gods. One common method involved casting lots. Small pieces of wood were marked with symbols and thrown onto a white cloth. A priest would pick up 3 pieces while looking at the sky and interpret their meaning. If the omens were favourable, the undertaking would proceed. If unfavourable, it would be abandoned or postponed. The flight of birds was another source of omens. Certain birds were considered messengers of the gods. Ravens were associated with Wodanaz and were especially significant. The direction a bird flew, the sounds it made, the circumstances of its appearance, all could be interpreted by those with the knowledge. Important decisions were rarely made without consulting the birds. Dreams were believed to carry messages from the gods and the dead. A significant dream might foretell the future or reveal hidden truths. Dream interpretation was a valued skill. Some individuals were known as especially gifted dreamers, whose visions were sought before important events. Dreams that came true enhanced the dreamer's reputation. Dreams that failed might be explained as misinterpretation rather than false prophecy. The Goths believed in an afterlife, though their beliefs were complex and varied. Warriors who died bravely in battle were taken to the hall of Wodanaz, where they feasted and fought until the end of the world. This belief encouraged courage in combat. A warrior who died fighting would enjoy eternal glory. One who fled and survived would live in shame. Those who died of illness or old age went to a different realm, a shadowy underworld ruled by a goddess of death. This was not necessarily a place of punishment, but it was less glorious than the warrior's paradise. The dead continued to exist in some form, aware of what happened in the world of the living. They could be contacted through rituals and might return to help or harm their descendants. Burial practices reflected these beliefs about the afterlife. The Goths practiced both cremation and inhumation at different times and places. Cremation was more common in earlier periods, with the ashes placed in urns and buried with grave goods. Inhumation became more common later, perhaps influenced by contact with Rome. Bodies were laid in graves with weapons, jewellery, and other objects they would need in the afterlife. Elite burials were elaborate affairs. A great chief might be buried with his horse, his weapons, his finest jewellery, and supplies for the journey to the afterworld. Slaves were sometimes killed and buried with their masters to serve them in death. The burial mound was raised high, visible from a distance, a lasting monument to the deceased. Funeral feasts brought the community together to honour the dead and comfort the living. The conversion to Christianity changed Gothic religious life profoundly, but the change was gradual. For generations, the old beliefs persisted alongside the new faith. Some Goths converted sincerely and abandoned the old ways entirely. Others adopted Christianity superficially while continuing traditional practices in private. Still others rejected Christianity and clung to the religion of their ancestors. The Christianity that the Goths adopted was Arianism, which differed from the Catholic Christianity of the Roman Empire. Arian Christians believed that Christ was created by God the Father and was subordinate to him. Catholic Christians believed that Father, Son, and Holy Spirit were co-equal and co-eternal. This theological difference had enormous practical consequences. It set the Goths apart from their Roman subjects when they later established kingdoms within the empire. Ulfilas, the apostle to the Goths, was the key figure in Gothic conversion. His translation of the Bible into Gothic gave the Goths access to Christian scripture in their own language. His missionary work over many decades brought thousands of Goths to the faith. His Arian theology became the standard form of Gothic Christianity. For centuries after his death, the Goths remained faithful to the version of Christianity he had taught them. Gothic Christianity developed its own distinctive character. The Goths built churches and established a clergy, but they maintained some of their traditional attitudes. Their Christianity was practical rather than mystical, focused on right behaviour rather than theological speculation. They valued the Bible as a source of law and guidance. They honoured their Arian bishops and priests as community leaders. The old festivals were gradually transformed into Christian celebrations. The winter solstice became Christmas. The spring fertility festival became Easter. Saints replaced the old gods as objects of veneration. Sacred groves gave way to churches, though some holy places retained their significance under new Christian names. The process of Christianization took centuries and was never entirely complete. The year 375 of the Common Era marks one of the great turning points in Gothic history. In that year, a terrifying new enemy appeared from the east. These were the Huns, nomadic warriors from the steppes of Central Asia. Their arrival shattered the Gothic world and set in motion events that would bring down the Roman Empire in the west. The Huns were unlike any enemy the Goths had faced before. They were horse nomads who spent their entire lives in the saddle. They were said to eat, sleep, and even conduct business on horseback. Their legs were bowed from constant riding. Their faces were scarred from childhood, the result of ritual cuts meant to prevent beard growth. To Gothic and Roman eyes they seemed barely human, more like monsters from nightmare than ordinary men. Hunnic warfare was based on speed, mobility, and the composite bow. The Hunnic bow was a marvel of engineering, made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew glued together. It was short enough to use from horseback, but powerful enough to pierce armour at considerable distances. Hunnic warriors could shoot accurately while riding at full gallop, a skill that took years to develop. They would sweep down on their enemies, loose clouds of arrows, and retreat before any counterattack could be organised. The Huns had been moving westward across the steppes for decades, pushing other peoples before them. They conquered or absorbed the Alans, another nomadic people who lived east of the Goths. The Alans who survived either joined the Hunnic horde or fled westward, bringing terrifying stories of the new invaders. The Goths heard these stories and prepared for the worst. The Ostrogoths under King Ermanaric were the first to face the Hunnic onslaught. Ermanaric was old by this time, a legendary figure who had built a vast empire over decades of warfare, but age and past glories meant nothing against the Hunnic tide. The Huns swept through Ostrogothic territory with devastating speed. Town after town fell, army after army was destroyed. The Ostrogothic kingdom, which had seemed so powerful, collapsed in a matter of months. The sources tell us that Ermanaric died during this catastrophe, though they disagree about how. Some say he killed himself in despair, unable to bear the destruction of everything he had built. Others say he was assassinated by enemies who blamed him for the disaster. Still others say he died of wounds suffered in battle against the Huns. Whatever the truth, his death marked the end of Ostrogothic independence for nearly a century. The Ostrogothic survivors faced a terrible choice. They could submit to Hunnic rule and become subjects of the conquerors. They could flee westward and seek safety in Roman territory, or they could fight on in hopeless resistance until they were destroyed. Different groups made different choices. Many Ostrogoths submitted to the Huns and served them as subject warriors. Others fled to join their Visigothic cousins. A few held out in remote areas, maintaining a precarious independence. The Visigoths watched the destruction of the Ostrogothic kingdom with horror. They knew they would be next. Their king, Athanaric, tried to organise resistance. He built fortifications along the Dnester River and prepared to make a stand. But the Huns were not so easily stopped. They crossed the river at night, catching the Visigoths by surprise. Athanaric's defensive line collapsed, and the Visigoths fled in panic. The Visigothic nation was now in desperate straits. The Huns were behind them, and there was no hope of defeating them in battle. To the south lay the Danube River, and beyond it the Roman Empire. The Visigoths had raided Roman territory many times in the past. They had fought Roman armies and sometimes won, but they had never sought to enter the empire as refugees. Now they had no choice. In 376, a vast host of Visigoths gathered on the northern bank of the Danube. There were perhaps 200,000 people in this host, though ancient numbers are always uncertain. Men, women, and children, warriors and farmers, the old and the young. They brought whatever possessions they could carry, their animals, their wagons, their household goods. They were a nation in flight, seeking safety from the Hunnic terror. The Visigoths sent envoys across the river to the Roman authorities. They asked permission to cross the Danube and settle within the empire. In return, they promised to serve Rome as soldiers and farmers. They would defend the frontier against other barbarians. They would pay taxes and obey Roman laws. They asked only for land to live on and protection from the Huns. The Roman emperor at this time was Valens, who ruled the eastern half of the empire from Constantinople. Valens faced a difficult decision. Allowing a barbarian nation to settle within the empire was unprecedented and dangerous. But the Visigoths offered significant benefits. They would provide soldiers for Roman armies which were always short of manpower. They would farm land that had been depopulated by plague and war. And if Valens refused them, they might cross the river anyway, as enemies rather than allies. Valens decided to admit the Visigoths. He sent orders to the frontier commanders to allow the crossing and to provide food and supplies for the refugees. It seemed like a reasonable decision at the time. The Romans had absorbed barbarian groups before. The Visigoths were Christians, which made them more acceptable than pagan barbarians. Their military strength could be useful against other threats. What could go wrong? Everything went wrong. The crossing of the Danube became a disaster of epic proportions. The Roman officials responsible for managing the refugees were corrupt and incompetent. Instead of providing the promised food and supplies, they hoarded them for profit. They sold rotten meat to starving Visigoths at outrageous prices. They demanded bribes for every service. They even bought Visigothic children as slaves in exchange for dog meat. The Visigoths had come to Rome as supplicants, desperate for help. They were treated as victims to be exploited. Their gratitude turned to anger, their hope to despair. They had given up their weapons as a condition of crossing the river, but now they began to rearm. They traded whatever they had for swords and spears. They ambushed Roman supply convoys. They prepared for war. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Skirmishes broke out between Visigoths and Roman troops. The Roman commanders tried to contain the situation through a combination of force and negotiation, but they lacked the resources to do either effectively. More Goths crossed the Danube, including Ostrogothic refugees fleeing the Huns. The barbarian population within the empire swelled beyond any possibility of control. In 377, open warfare erupted. The Visigoths, now led by a chief named Fritigern, began raiding throughout the Balkans. Roman forces sent against them were defeated in a series of engagements. The Goths plundered towns and villages, taking revenge for their mistreatment. They were joined by escaped slaves, disaffected peasants, and other barbarian groups. The Balkans descended into chaos. Emperor Valens was in the east, dealing with threats from Persia. He hurried back to Constantinople and began gathering an army to crush the Gothic revolt. His nephew Gratian, who ruled the western half of the empire, promised to bring reinforcements. Valens was advised to wait for Gratian's arrival before engaging the Goths. Together the two emperors would have overwhelming force. But Valens was impatient. He was jealous of Gratian's military reputation and wanted the glory of victory for himself. Reports suggested that the Gothic army was smaller than expected. Valens decided to attack before Gratian arrived, claiming the triumph alone. It was a decision that would cost him his life and change the course of history. On August 9th, 378, the Roman army met the Visigoths near the city of Adrianople in what is now northwestern Turkey. The Romans had perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 soldiers, a formidable force by any standard. They approached the Gothic camp, where the Visigoths had formed their wagons into a defensive circle. The day was hot, and the Roman soldiers had marched for hours without food or water. What happened next remains somewhat unclear, as the sources give conflicting accounts. It appears that negotiations were underway when fighting broke out, possibly by accident. The Roman infantry advanced against the Gothic wagon circle. Then, at the worst possible moment, the Gothic cavalry returned from a foraging expedition. They crashed into the Roman flank with devastating effect. The Battle of Adrianople became a slaughter. The Roman infantry, packed tightly together, could not manoeuvre or fight effectively. The Gothic cavalry rode them down, while Gothic infantry attacked from the front. The Romans broke and fled, but there was no escape. The Goths pursued them relentlessly, cutting down the fugitives. By nightfall, 2/3 of the Roman army lay dead on the field. Emperor Valens was among the fallen. The sources disagree about exactly how he died. Some say he was struck down in the fighting and his body was never found. Others say he was wounded and carried to a nearby farmhouse, which the Goths then burned down around him. However he died, his death marked a catastrophe for the Roman Empire. Not since Hannibal's victory at Cannae, nearly 600 years earlier, had Rome suffered such a devastating defeat. The Battle of Adrianople is often cited as one of the most significant battles in world history. It demonstrated that the Roman army, which had dominated the Mediterranean world for centuries, could be destroyed by barbarian forces. It showed that cavalry, not infantry, would dominate warfare in the coming centuries. It opened the door for barbarian settlement within the empire on terms that Rome could not control. The long decline of the Western Roman Empire can be traced from this moment. The immediate aftermath of Adrianople was chaos. The Goths roamed freely through the Balkans, plundering at will. They even approached the walls of Constantinople itself, though they lacked the siege equipment to take the city. The new emperor, Theodosius, had to rebuild Roman military power almost from scratch. It took years of patient effort before he could confront the Goths from a position of strength. Theodosius eventually made peace with the Visigoths in 382. The treaty he negotiated was unprecedented. The Visigoths were allowed to settle within the empire as a semi-autonomous nation. They kept their own laws and their own leaders. They were not dispersed and absorbed into the Roman population as previous barbarian settlers had been. They remained a distinct people, living under their own kings within Roman territory. In return, the Visigoths promised to provide soldiers for Roman armies. They would fight as allies, not as subjects. Their warriors would serve under their own commanders, following their own traditions. This was a new kind of relationship between Rome and the barbarians. The Visigoths were neither fully Roman nor fully independent. They were something in between, a nation within the nation. The Treaty of 382 set a precedent that would be followed many times in the coming decades. Other barbarian groups would seek similar arrangements. The Roman Empire would gradually fill with semi-autonomous barbarian kingdoms, each owing nominal allegiance to the emperor, but effectively ruling themselves. The Western Empire would eventually dissolve into a collection of such kingdoms, while the Eastern Empire would survive by adapting to the new reality. The Ostrogoths, meanwhile, remained under Hunnic domination. For nearly 80 years, they served the Hunnic kings as subject warriors. They fought in Hunnic armies against other peoples, including sometimes their Visigothic cousins. They paid tribute and provided hostages. Their kings ruled only with Hunnic permission. It was a humiliating situation for a proud people, but they endured and waited for their chance to break free. The Hunnic Empire reached its greatest extent under Attila, who ruled from 434 to 453. Attila was one of the most feared figures in ancient history. The Romans called him the Scourge of God, a divine punishment for their sins. He welded the Hunnic tribes into a unified force and demanded tribute from both halves of the Roman Empire. His armies ravaged the Balkans and invaded Gaul and Italy. For a generation, he terrorized the known world. The Ostrogoths served in Attila's armies during these campaigns. They fought at the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains in 451, where Attila was finally stopped by a coalition of Romans and Visigoths. They witnessed the invasion of Italy in 452, when Attila sacked cities throughout the Po Valley. They were present when Attila died suddenly in 453, reportedly from a nosebleed on his wedding night. Attila's death shattered the Hunnic Empire. His sons quarrelled over the succession and divided the realm among themselves. The subject peoples saw their chance and rose in revolt. The Ostrogoths were among the first to rebel. At the Battle of Nedau in 454 or 455, a coalition of Germanic peoples defeated the Huns and won their freedom. The Hunnic Empire collapsed as quickly as it had risen. The Ostrogoths were free at last, but they faced an uncertain future. Their old homeland north of the Black Sea was lost forever. They needed new lands to settle, new resources to sustain their people. They turned their eyes toward the Roman Empire, where their Visigothic cousins had already established themselves. The stage was set for the next chapter of Gothic history. We have already touched upon the Battle of Adrianople, but this pivotal moment deserves deeper exploration. The events of August 9, 378, represented more than just a military defeat. They marked a fundamental shift in the relationship between Rome and the barbarian peoples. Let us examine this battle and its consequences in greater detail. The road to Adrianople began with the Hunnic invasions that drove the Goths across the Danube. But the immediate cause of the battle was Roman mismanagement of the Gothic refugees. The corruption and cruelty of Roman officials transformed potential allies into bitter enemies. The Goths had come seeking protection and were given exploitation instead. Fritigern emerged as the leader of the Visigothic resistance. He was a skilled commander who understood both Gothic and Roman ways of war. He had dealt with Romans before, sometimes as enemy and sometimes as ally. He knew their strengths and their weaknesses. He would use this knowledge to devastating effect at Adrianople. The Gothic forces at Adrianople were not just Visigoths. The host included Ostrogothic refugees who had fled the Huns. It included Alans, the nomadic people who had been conquered by the Huns before the Goths. It included escaped slaves and deserters from the Roman army. It was a coalition of the desperate and the dispossessed, united by their grievances against Rome. The Gothic cavalry played a decisive role in the battle. These horsemen were away from the main camp when the Roman army arrived. They were foraging for supplies in the surrounding countryside. Their absence may have encouraged Valens to attack, thinking the Gothic force was smaller than it actually was. Their return at the critical moment turned a difficult battle into a catastrophic defeat. The Roman army that Valens led to Adrianople was a formidable force, but it was not the Roman army of earlier centuries. The legions that had conquered the Mediterranean world were long gone. The army of the 4th century was different in composition and organisation. It relied more heavily on cavalry and on barbarian auxiliaries. It was still effective, but it was not invincible. The conditions on the day of battle favoured the Goths. The August heat was brutal, and the Roman soldiers had marched for hours without adequate water. They were tired and thirsty before the fighting even began. The Gothic wagon circle provided a strong defensive position. The Romans had to attack uphill against prepared defences. Everything was stacked against them. When the Gothic cavalry struck the Roman flank, the battle was effectively decided. The Roman infantry was packed too tightly to respond effectively. They could not turn to face the new threat without exposing themselves to attack from the front. They could not retreat without being ridden down. They were trapped and slaughtered. The casualties at Adrianople were staggering. Ancient sources claim that 2/3 of the Roman army was killed, perhaps 10 to 15,000 men. Among the dead were numerous high-ranking officers, including several generals. The emperor himself was killed, the second Roman emperor to die in battle against barbarians. The first had been Decius, killed by Goths at Abritus over a century earlier. The psychological impact of Adrianople was as significant as the military impact. The Roman army had been defeated before, but never so completely by a barbarian force within the empire's own borders. The myth of Roman invincibility was shattered. Barbarians throughout the empire and beyond took note. If the Goths could destroy a Roman army and kill an emperor, perhaps others could do the same. Emperor Theodosius, who succeeded Valens, faced an almost impossible task. He had to rebuild Roman military power while the Goths roamed freely through the Balkans. He had to restore confidence in Roman arms while lacking the forces to win a decisive victory. He had to find a solution that would end the Gothic threat without resources adequate for conquest. Theodosius was a pragmatist. He recognized that the Goths could not be defeated by force alone. They were too numerous, too well armed, and too desperate. Any attempt to destroy them would cost more Roman lives than Rome could afford to lose. The only viable option was negotiation, finding terms that both sides could accept. The Treaty of 382 was the result of years of negotiation. Its terms were unprecedented, but reflected the reality of the situation. The Visigoths received land within the empire, primarily in the Diocese of Thrace. They were allowed to live under their own laws and their own leaders. They paid no taxes but were obligated to provide military service when called upon. This arrangement created something new in Roman history, a barbarian nation living within the empire but not subject to Roman law. Previous barbarian settlers had been dispersed and absorbed. They had become Romans over time, losing their separate identity. The Visigoths remained Visigoths, a distinct people with their own king, their own army, and their own interests. The treaty worked, after a fashion. The Visigoths stopped raiding and settled down to farm their new lands. They provided soldiers for Roman armies, fighting against other barbarians and sometimes against Roman rebels. The Balkans enjoyed a period of relative peace. Theodosius could turn his attention to other matters, including the religious controversies that divided the Christian Church. But the underlying tensions remained. The Visigoths were never fully satisfied with their situation. They wanted more land, more recognition, more autonomy. They chafed under Roman oversight and resented Roman arrogance. They remembered the broken promises and the mistreatment that had led to war. They waited for opportunities to improve their position. The Romans, for their part, never fully trusted the Visigoths. They saw them as dangerous barbarians who might turn hostile at any moment. They tried to manipulate Gothic politics, supporting some leaders and undermining others. They used the Visigoths when convenient and discarded them when not. The relationship was unstable, prone to breakdown at any moment. Theodosius died in 395, leaving the empire to his two young sons. Arcadius received the eastern half, ruling from Constantinople. Honorius received the western half, ruling from Milan and later Ravenna. Neither son was competent to rule. Real power fell to their advisors and generals, who pursued their own agendas. The division of the empire between Arcadius and Honorius would prove permanent. The eastern and western halves would never be reunited under a single ruler. They would drift apart, developing different characters and facing different challenges. The Eastern Empire would survive for another 1,000 years, evolving into what we call the Byzantine Empire. The Western Empire would collapse within a century, its territories divided among barbarian kingdoms. The Visigoths found themselves caught between the two halves of this divided empire. They were settled in the Balkans, which belonged to the Eastern Empire, but their ambitions increasingly turned westward, toward the wealthier and weaker Western Empire. They would play the two halves against each other, seeking advantage from their rivalry. The man who would lead the Visigoths through this turbulent period was already rising to prominence. His name was Alaric, and he would become one of the most famous figures in Gothic history. Alaric was born around 370 just a few years before the Great Migration across the Danube. He grew up in a world of war and displacement, shaped by the trauma of his people's flight from the Huns. Alaric served in the Roman army as a young man, commanding Gothic auxiliary troops. He fought for Emperor Theodosius in the civil wars that plagued the empire. He learned Roman military tactics and Roman political methods. He understood how the empire worked, its strengths and its weaknesses. This knowledge would serve him well in the years to come. When Theodosius died in 395, Alaric saw his opportunity. The new emperors were weak, and their advisors were more interested in fighting each other than in managing the barbarians. Alaric demanded better treatment for his people. He wanted a higher military rank for himself. He wanted more land and more supplies for the Visigoths. When these demands were refused, he took his people to war. The first target was Greece. Alaric led his warriors south through the Balkans, brushing aside the weak Roman forces sent to stop him. He entered Greece and ravaged the ancient land. Athens itself was threatened, though the city apparently bought him off with tribute. Corinth, Argos, and Sparta were plundered. The famous sanctuaries of Olympia and Eleusis were looted. Greece, the birthplace of Western civilization, lay at the mercy of Gothic swords. The Eastern Empire seemed helpless to stop Alaric, but the Western Empire had a capable general named Stilicho, himself of barbarian origin. Stilicho led a Western army into Greece and trapped Alaric in the mountains of the Peloponnese. Victory seemed within reach. Then, mysteriously, Stilicho withdrew. The reasons remain unclear. Perhaps he was recalled by political enemies. Perhaps he made a secret deal with Alaric. Whatever the cause, Alaric escaped and continued his career of destruction. The Eastern Empire eventually bought peace by giving Alaric what he wanted. He was appointed Master of Soldiers in Illyricum, a high military rank that gave him official status within the Roman system. His people received land and supplies. Alaric was now a Roman general, at least in name. But his loyalty remained with his own people, not with the empire that had given him his title. For the next few years, Alaric played a complex game of diplomacy and intimidation. He negotiated with both halves of the empire, seeking the best deal he could get. He threatened war when negotiations stalled. He made alliances and broke them as circumstances changed. He was a master of political manipulation, using Roman divisions to Gothic advantage. In 401, Alaric made his move against the Western Empire. He led his people across the Alps and invaded Italy itself. The Western court fled from Milan to the more defensible city of Ravenna, protected by marshes and difficult terrain. Stilicho gathered what forces he could and marched to meet the Gothic threat. The campaigns of 402 and 403 were hard fought but inconclusive. Stilicho won tactical victories at Pollentia and Verona, but he could not destroy Alaric's army. The Visigoths withdrew from Italy but remained a threat. Alaric was biding his time, waiting for the right moment to strike again. That moment came in 408. Stilicho, the one Roman general capable of dealing with Alaric, fell victim to court intrigue. He was accused of treason and executed by order of Emperor Honorius. With Stilicho gone, the Western Empire lost its best defender. Even worse, the Roman soldiers massacred the families of the barbarian auxiliaries who had served under Stilicho. Thousands of these warriors fled to join Alaric, swelling his forces with experienced troops who now had personal reasons to hate Rome. Alaric invaded Italy again in 408. This time, there was no Stilicho to stop him. He marched through the peninsula almost unopposed, heading for Rome itself. The Eternal City, which had not been captured by a foreign enemy in 800 years, was about to face its greatest test. The city of Rome in the early 5th century was no longer the political capital of the Western Empire. The emperors had moved to Milan and then to Ravenna, seeking safety from barbarian threats. But Rome remained the symbolic heart of the empire. It was the city of the Caesars, the seat of the Senate, the centre of Roman civilization. Its fall would send shockwaves throughout the known world. Rome in this period was still a magnificent city, though past its peak. Its population had declined from over 1 million to perhaps half that number, but it still boasted the greatest monuments of the ancient world. The Colosseum still stood, though gladiatorial games had recently been banned. The great temples still rose above the streets, though many had been converted to Christian churches. The forums, the baths, the aqueducts all testified to Roman greatness. The city was also fabulously wealthy. Centuries of conquest had filled Rome with treasure from across the known world. The great senatorial families possessed enormous fortunes. The churches held gold and silver accumulated over generations of donations. Even in decline, Rome was one of the richest cities on earth. This wealth made it an irresistible target. Alaric arrived before the walls of Rome in late 408. His army surrounded the city, cutting off supplies from the outside. Rome had not been besieged in living memory, and the population was unprepared for what followed. Food grew scarce, prices soared, the poor began to starve while the rich hoarded what they had. The Senate sent envoys to negotiate with Alaric. They tried to bluff, claiming that the population was ready to fight to the death. Alaric laughed at them. He knew the city could not hold out. He demanded an enormous ransom, 5,000 pounds of gold, 30,000 pounds of silver, 4,000 silk robes, 3,000 scarlet-dyed skins, and 3,000 pounds of pepper. The Senate had no choice but to pay. Alaric withdrew after receiving the ransom, but the underlying issues remained unresolved. He still wanted land for his people, official recognition from the empire, and regular supplies of grain and gold. He negotiated with Emperor Honorius, who was safe in Ravenna, protected by marshes and walls. Honorius was weak and vacillating, influenced by advisers who counselled resistance. The negotiations dragged on through 409. Alaric grew frustrated. He marched on Rome again, and this time took a different approach. Instead of besieging the city, he convinced the Senate to proclaim a rival emperor, a man named Priscus Attalus. Alaric hoped to use Attalus as a puppet, a Roman face for Gothic demands. But Attalus proved incompetent and was eventually discarded. By 410, Alaric had lost patience. He had tried negotiation, he had tried installing a puppet emperor, and nothing had worked. Honorius refused to give him what he wanted. The only option left was force. Alaric marched on Rome for the third time, determined to take the city and show the empire that the Visigoths could not be ignored. The siege began in August 410. The city was already weakened by the previous sieges and the disruption of trade. Food was scarce, disease was spreading, and morale was low. The walls of Rome were ancient and not designed for modern siege warfare. The garrison was inadequate to defend the entire circuit. Everyone knew the city could not hold out indefinitely. On the night of August 24th, 410, someone opened the Salarian gates from the inside. Who did this and why remains a mystery. Some sources blame slaves who sympathised with the Goths. Others suggest it was Gothic soldiers who had infiltrated the city. Still others hint at treachery by Roman aristocrats seeking to save their own skins. Whatever the truth, the gates swung open, and the Visigoths poured into Rome. The sack of Rome lasted 3 days. Alaric had ordered his men to respect churches and spare those who took refuge in them. The Visigoths were Christians after all, even if their Arian faith differed from Roman Catholicism. Many Romans fled to the great basilicas of St. Peter and St. Paul, where they were indeed left unmolested. This restraint was noted by contemporaries and helped shape the memory of the sack. But outside the churches, the Visigoths took what they wanted. They plundered the great houses of the aristocracy. They stripped gold and silver from public buildings. They carried off treasures that had been accumulating for centuries. They took slaves, including many noble women who would spend years in captivity. The wealth of Rome flowed into Gothic hands. There was violence as well. Some Romans resisted and were killed. Some were murdered for their valuables. Some women were raped despite Alaric's orders. The sources disagree about the extent of the killing and destruction. Some describe scenes of horror, while others emphasize the relative restraint of the Goths. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. After 3 days, Alaric led his people out of Rome. They headed south, laden with plunder, seeking to cross to Africa. Africa was the breadbasket of the Western Empire, the source of the grain that fed Rome. If Alaric could seize Africa, he would have a secure base and a stranglehold on the empire's food supply. It was a bold plan, worthy of his ambition, but Alaric would never reach Africa. A storm destroyed the ships he had gathered for the crossing. Shortly afterward, Alaric himself fell ill and died. He was only about 40 years old, cut down at the height of his power. The Visigoths buried him in the bed of the Busento River in southern Italy. They diverted the river, dug the grave, placed Alaric's body with his treasures, and then let the river flow back over the site. The slaves who had done the work were killed to keep the location secret. To this day, no one knows where Alaric lies. The sack of Rome sent shockwaves throughout the Mediterranean world. Saint Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, declared that the city which had conquered the world had itself been conquered. Saint Augustine, in North Africa, began writing his great work, The City of God, attempting to explain how God could allow such a catastrophe. Pagans blamed the Christians for abandoning the old gods. Christians blamed the pagans for their sins. Everyone agreed that something fundamental had changed. Yet the sack of Rome was not the end of the Western Empire. Honorius continued to rule from Ravenna. The Senate continued to meet in Rome. The machinery of government continued to function after a fashion. The city itself recovered from the sack, though it would never regain its former glory. The empire staggered on for another 66 years before the final collapse. The Visigoths, meanwhile, had to find a new leader and a new direction. Alaric's brother-in-law, Athalf, succeeded him as king. Athalf led the Visigoths out of Italy and into Gaul, seeking new lands to settle. He carried with him a remarkable captive, Galla Placidia, the sister of Emperor Honorius, captured during the sack of Rome. Galla Placidia was one of the most remarkable women of the ancient world. She was a Roman princess, daughter of Emperor Theodosius, sister of 2 emperors. She had been captured by the Goths and spent years among them, first as a hostage and then as something more. Athalf fell in love with her, or at least saw the political advantages of marrying her. In 414, they were wed in an elaborate ceremony at Narbonne. The marriage of Athalf and Galla Placidia represented a potential fusion of Gothic and Roman worlds. Athalf reportedly said that he had once dreamed of replacing Romania with Gothia, of erasing the Roman name and creating a Gothic empire. But he had come to realize that the Goths were too undisciplined to rule without Roman law and institutions. Instead, he hoped to use Gothic strength to restore Roman glory, with himself as the restorer. This vision of Gothic-Roman partnership would influence Gothic policy for generations. The Visigoths did not seek to destroy Roman civilization, but to take it over and preserve it. They saw themselves as defenders of Rome, not its enemies. They adopted Roman titles, Roman ceremonies, and Roman administrative practices. They became more Roman even as Rome became more Gothic. But Athalf did not live to see his vision realized. He was assassinated in 415 by a servant with a personal grudge. The Visigothic kingdom fell into chaos as rivals competed for power. Galla Placidia was eventually returned to the Romans as part of a peace treaty. She would go on to become one of the most powerful figures in the Western Empire, ruling as regent for her young son, Valentinian III. The Visigoths eventually found stability under King Wallia, who made peace with the empire and agreed to fight on Rome's behalf against other barbarian groups in Spain. In return, the Visigoths received land in southwestern Gaul in the region around Toulouse. This would become the heartland of the Visigothic kingdom, a base from which they would eventually expand to control most of Spain. The settlement of the Visigoths in southwestern Gaul marks a new chapter in their history. They were no longer wandering refugees or marauding invaders. They were now a settled kingdom with defined territory, established institutions, and a recognized place in the post-Roman world. The transformation from tribe to kingdom would take generations to complete, but it began here in the rich lands around Toulouse. The region the Visigoths received was known as Aquitaine. It was one of the wealthiest parts of Gaul, blessed with fertile soil, a mild climate, and prosperous cities. The city of Toulouse became the Visigothic capital, the seat of their kings, and the centre of their government. From Toulouse, the Visigoths would rule an expanding realm for nearly a century. The terms of the Visigothic settlement followed a Roman system called hospitalitas. Under this system, barbarian soldiers were billeted with Roman landowners, who were required to share their property with the newcomers. The exact division varied, but typically the barbarians received 1/3 to 2/3 of the land and its revenues. This system allowed the Visigoths to be supported without completely dispossessing the Roman population. The Visigothic kingdom in Gaul was not a purely Gothic state. The Roman population remained, and Roman institutions continued to function alongside Gothic ones. Roman aristocrats still owned estates, still served in administrative positions, still maintained their social networks. The Catholic Church continued its activities even though the Gothic rulers were Arian Christians. Two societies existed side by side, separate but interconnected. The early Visigothic kings worked to expand their territory while maintaining their alliance with Rome. They fought against other barbarian groups that had invaded Gaul, including the Vandals, the Alans, and the Suebi. These campaigns took them into Spain, which had been overrun by barbarians in the chaos following the sack of Rome. The Visigoths cleared much of Spain of rival groups, though some, like the Suebi in the northwest, maintained independent kingdoms. King Theodoric I was one of the most important early Visigothic rulers. He reigned from 418 to 451, a long tenure that provided stability and continuity. Theodoric expanded Visigothic territory and strengthened Visigothic institutions. He maintained the alliance with Rome while pursuing independent policies when it suited him. He was a skilled diplomat who navigated the complex politics of the dying Western Empire. Theodoric's greatest test came in 451 when Attila and his Huns invaded Gaul. We have already mentioned this invasion in our discussion of the Ostrogoths. Now let us examine it from the Visigothic perspective. Attila's horde was the greatest threat the Western world had faced in generations. If the Huns conquered Gaul, the Visigothic kingdom would be destroyed, along with everything else. The Roman general Aetius, sometimes called the last of the Romans, organised the defence of Gaul. He knew he could not defeat Attila with Roman forces alone. He needed allies, and the most powerful potential ally was the Visigothic kingdom. Aetius travelled to Toulouse and convinced Theodoric to join the coalition against the Huns. It was an alliance of former enemies against a common threat. The two armies met Attila at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, somewhere in northeastern Gaul. The exact location is disputed, but the battle itself was one of the largest and bloodiest of the ancient world. Tens of thousands of warriors clashed in a struggle that would determine the fate of Western civilization. The fighting lasted from afternoon until nightfall, and continued sporadically through the night. The battle was a strategic victory for the Roman Visigothic alliance. Attila was stopped and forced to retreat, but the cost was enormous. King Theodoric was killed in the fighting, trampled by his own cavalry, according to some accounts. His son Thorismund was proclaimed king on the battlefield, raised on a shield in the traditional Germanic manner. The Visigoths had helped save Gaul, but they had lost their king. Thorismund's reign was brief and troubled. He quarrelled with his brothers and was assassinated after only 2 years. His brother Theodoric II succeeded him and ruled until 466. Theodoric II continued the expansion of Visigothic power, intervening in Spanish affairs and extending Gothic influence. He was also assassinated, killed by his brother Euric, who would prove to be the greatest of the early Visigothic kings. Euric reigned from 466 to 484 and transformed the Visigothic kingdom into a major power. He conquered most of Spain, pushing the Suebi into a small corner of the northwest. He expanded into Gaul, taking Provence and threatening the Rhone valley. He effectively broke with the Western Roman Empire, which was in its final death throes. When the last Western emperor was deposed in 476, Euric barely noticed. He was already ruling as an independent king, not as a Roman ally. Euric was also a lawgiver. He issued the first written law code for the Visigoths, compiling their traditional customs into written form. This code applied to Goths living in the kingdom, while the Roman population continued to live under Roman law. The existence of 2 parallel legal systems reflected the continued separation of Gothic and Roman communities. Full integration would take centuries. The Visigothic kingdom under Euric stretched from the Loire River in Gaul to the Straits of Gibraltar in Spain. It was the largest and most powerful of the barbarian kingdoms that had emerged from the ruins of the Western Empire. Only the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy, which we will discuss in the next chapter, rivaled it in size and importance. But the Visigothic kingdom faced challenges that would ultimately prove fatal. The religious divide between Arian Goths and Catholic Romans created constant tension. The Catholic Church was the most powerful institution in post-Roman society, and it was hostile to Arian rule. Catholic bishops organised resistance, maintained contact with other Catholic powers, and waited for deliverance from heretical rule. The Franks to the north were another growing threat. The Franks had converted to Catholic Christianity under King Clovis around 496. This gave them the support of the Catholic Church and the sympathy of the Catholic population in Visigothic territory. Clovis portrayed his wars against the Visigoths as religious crusades, battles against heretics rather than mere political conflicts. In 507, Clovis invaded the Visigothic kingdom. The 2 armies met at the Battle of Vouillé, near Poitiers. The Franks won a decisive victory. The Visigothic king Alaric II was killed, reportedly by Clovis himself. The Visigoths lost almost all their territory in Gaul, retaining only a strip of coastline called Septimania. The centre of Visigothic power shifted permanently to Spain. The loss of Gaul was a catastrophe, but the Visigothic kingdom survived. It reorganised around its Spanish territories and continued for another 2 centuries. Toledo became the new capital, replacing Toulouse. The Visigoths consolidated their control over the Iberian Peninsula, eventually conquering the Suebi kingdom in the northwest and pushing the Byzantine Empire out of its enclaves in the south. The 6th century was a period of consolidation and development for the Visigothic kingdom in Spain. The kings worked to strengthen royal authority and reduce the power of the nobility. They developed more sophisticated administrative systems, borrowing from Roman and Byzantine models. They patronized the arts and encouraged learning. The Visigothic kingdom became one of the most advanced states in post-Roman Europe. One of the most important developments was the conversion of the Visigoths from Arianism to Catholic Christianity. This happened in 589 under King Recared. Richard announced his conversion at the Third Council of Toledo, a great church council attended by bishops from throughout the kingdom. The conversion ended the religious divide between Goths and Romans and opened the way for greater integration of the two peoples. The conversion to Catholicism transformed the Visigothic kingdom. The Catholic Church became a pillar of royal power, supporting the king and legitimizing his rule. The bishops became important advisors and administrators. Church councils became forums for discussing not just religious matters, but also political and legal issues. The kingdom took on an increasingly theocratic character. The greatest figure of the Visigothic Church was Isidore of Seville. Isidore was a bishop and scholar who lived from around 560 to 636. He was one of the most learned men of his age, author of numerous works on theology, history, and science. His most famous work, the Etymologies, was an encyclopedia that attempted to compile all human knowledge. It was widely copied and studied throughout the Middle Ages. Isidore also wrote a history of the Goths that is one of our most important sources for their story. He traced Gothic history from their legendary origins to his own time, celebrating their achievements and their Christian faith. For Isidore, the Goths were a chosen people destined by God to rule Spain. His history helped create a sense of Gothic identity and pride that would persist for centuries. The 7th century saw the Visigothic kingdom reach its greatest extent and then begin its decline. The kings struggled to control ambitious nobles who sought power for themselves. Succession disputes led to civil wars. The economy weakened as trade declined and agriculture suffered. The kingdom remained powerful, but it was increasingly fragile. The legal system of the Visigothic kingdom deserves special attention. Building on Uric's earlier code, later kings developed increasingly sophisticated law codes. The most important was the Liber Judiciorum, issued by King Receswinth in 654. This code applied to all inhabitants of the kingdom, Goths and Romans alike. It marked the end of the dual legal system and the beginning of a unified Visigothic society. The Liber Judiciorum was a remarkable achievement. It covered all aspects of law, from criminal justice to property rights to family relations. It was systematic, comprehensive, and relatively humane by the standards of the time. It would influence Spanish law for centuries after the Visigothic kingdom itself had fallen. Even today, scholars study it as an example of early medieval legal thinking. Visigothic art and architecture also flourished during this period. The Visigoths built churches throughout Spain, some of which survive to this day. These churches combined Roman building techniques with Germanic decorative traditions. They featured horseshoe arches, a distinctive element that would later influence Islamic architecture in Spain. Visigothic metalwork, especially jewellery and church furnishings, was highly sophisticated. The crown jewels of the Visigothic kings were among the most magnificent objects of the early medieval world. Several of these crowns survive, discovered in the 19th century at Guarazar near Toledo. They are made of gold, decorated with precious stones, and hanging letters that spell out the names of the kings who commissioned them. They were votive crowns, meant to be hung above altars rather than worn, but they testify to the wealth and artistic skill of the Visigothic kingdom. But beneath the surface splendour, the Visigothic kingdom was weakening. The nobility grew more powerful and more independent. The kings struggled to maintain control. Succession disputes became more frequent and more violent. The Jews, who had lived in Spain since Roman times, were subjected to increasing persecution, creating a disaffected minority within the kingdom. The final crisis came in 710. King Witiza died, and the succession was disputed. One faction supported Witiza's sons. Another faction elected a noble named Roderick as king. Civil war erupted. In their desperation, one faction reportedly invited outside help from across the Straits of Gibraltar. The help that came would destroy the Visigothic kingdom forever. In 711, a Muslim army crossed from North Africa into Spain. The Muslims had conquered North Africa in the decades following the death of the Prophet Muhammad. They were motivated by religious zeal and the prospect of plunder. The divided Visigothic kingdom was an easy target. The decisive battle came at Guadalete in southern Spain. King Roderick led the Visigothic army against the Muslim invaders. The battle was a catastrophe. Roderick was killed, and the Visigothic army was destroyed. The Muslims swept through Spain, conquering city after city. Within a few years, almost the entire peninsula was in Muslim hands. The Visigothic kingdom, which had endured for 3 centuries, was gone. Only in the mountainous north did Christian resistance survive. From these small Christian kingdoms in the north would eventually emerge the states that would reconquer Spain over the following 8 centuries. But that is another story beyond the scope of our tale. The legacy of the Visigoths in Spain was profound. They had ruled the peninsula for 300 years, shaping its institutions, its laws, and its culture. The Liber Judiciorum influenced Spanish law for centuries. Visigothic churches still stand as monuments to their builders. The very idea of Spain as a unified Christian kingdom owes something to the Visigothic precedent. While the Visigoths were building their kingdom in Gaul and Spain, their Ostrogothic cousins were following a different path. We left the Ostrogoths as they emerged from Hunnic domination after the Battle of Nedau in 454 or 455. Now let us follow their story as they carved out a kingdom of their own in the heart of the old Roman Empire. The Ostrogoths, who survived Hunnic rule, were a changed people. They had spent nearly 80 years as subjects of the Huns, fighting in Hunnic armies and living under Hunnic law. They had intermarried with Huns and other subject peoples. They had adopted Hunnic customs, including styles of dress and methods of warfare. But they had also preserved their Gothic identity, their language, and their sense of themselves as a distinct people. After Nedau, the Ostrogoths needed a new homeland. Their old territories north of the Black Sea were lost forever. They wandered through the Balkans, sometimes fighting for the Eastern Roman Empire, sometimes fighting against it. They were a powerful military force, but they lacked a secure base. They needed land, and they needed a leader who could win it for them. That leader emerged in the person of Theodoric, who would become known as Theodoric the Great. Theodoric was born around 454, just as the Ostrogoths were winning their freedom from the Huns. He was a member of the Amal dynasty, the royal family that had led the Ostrogoths for generations. His father was a king, and Theodoric was raised to rule. As a boy, Theodoric was sent to Constantinople as a hostage. This was a common practice in relations between the empire and the barbarians. Hostages guaranteed that treaties would be kept. They also served another purpose. They exposed barbarian princes to Roman civilization, teaching them Roman ways and creating bonds of loyalty to the empire. Theodoric spent about 10 years in Constantinople, from roughly 461 to 471. He received a Roman education, learning to read and write, studying rhetoric and philosophy. He observed the workings of the imperial court, the ceremonies and protocols that surrounded the emperor. He saw the wealth and sophistication of the greatest city in the world. These experiences shaped him profoundly, but Theodoric never forgot that he was a Goth. He returned to his people as a young man and quickly established himself as a leader. He was tall and strong, a skilled warrior who led from the front. He was also intelligent and charismatic, able to inspire loyalty and manage complex political situations. He united the Ostrogoths under his rule and began looking for opportunities to advance their position. The Eastern Empire under Emperor Zeno had a problem. Another Gothic leader, also named Theodoric, was causing trouble in the Balkans. This other, Theodoric, known as Theodoric Strabo, led a rival group of Goths and was constantly demanding more from the empire. Zeno played the two Theodorics against each other, supporting first one and then the other. This game of divide and rule eventually backfired. Theodoric the Amal grew tired of being manipulated. He led his people against Constantinople itself, ravaging the suburbs of the great city. Zeno needed to find a way to get rid of this dangerous barbarian without destroying him. The solution he found was elegant: send Theodoric to Italy. Italy in 488 was ruled by Odoacer, a barbarian general who had deposed the last Western Roman emperor in 476. Odoacer was not a Goth, but a member of another Germanic tribe, possibly the Sciri or the Heruli. He ruled Italy competently, but without legitimacy in Roman eyes. He was a usurper, a barbarian who had overthrown the rightful government. Zeno commissioned Theodoric to overthrow Odoacer and rule Italy in the emperor's name. This arrangement suited everyone. Zeno got rid of a troublesome barbarian army. Theodoric got a wealthy kingdom to rule. The Ostrogoths got a new homeland. And the arrangement had a veneer of legitimacy, since Theodoric would rule as the emperor's representative, not as an independent king. Theodoric led his people into Italy in 489. The entire Ostrogothic nation came with him, perhaps 100,000 people, including women, children, and the elderly. This was not just a military campaign, but a migration, a permanent relocation of an entire people. They crossed the Alps and descended into the Po Valley, ready to fight for their new home. Odoacer resisted fiercely. He was a capable commander with loyal troops. The war lasted nearly 4 years, with major battles and prolonged sieges. Theodoric won most of the engagements, but Odoacer held out in his capital of Ravenna, protected by the marshes that surrounded the city. The siege of Ravenna dragged on for years. Finally, in 493, the two leaders negotiated a settlement. They agreed to rule Italy jointly, sharing power between them. Theodoric entered Ravenna in peace. A great banquet was held to celebrate the agreement. And at that banquet, Theodoric killed Odoacer with his own hands, striking him down with a sword. According to one account, Theodoric remarked that Odoacer seemed to have no bones. So easily did the blade pass through him. The murder of Odoacer was treacherous, but it was effective. Theodoric was now the sole ruler of Italy. He would reign for 33 years, until his death in 526. His reign would be remembered as a golden age, a time of peace and prosperity in a world that had known too much of war and chaos. Theodoric's Italy was a remarkable experiment in Gothic Roman cooperation. The Goths provided military defence, serving as the army that protected the kingdom. The Romans provided civil administration, running the government and the economy. The two peoples lived side by side, each with their own laws and customs, united under a single king. Theodoric himself embodied this dual identity. He was a Gothic warrior king, leading his people in the traditional manner. But he was also a Roman ruler, using Roman titles and Roman ceremonies. He called himself king, not emperor, acknowledging the theoretical supremacy of the emperor in Constantinople. But in practice, he ruled Italy as an independent sovereign. The administration of Theodoric's kingdom was largely Roman. He employed Roman officials to run the government, collect taxes, and administer justice. The most famous of these officials was Cassiodorus, a Roman aristocrat who served as Theodoric's secretary and chief minister. Cassiodorus wrote letters and edicts in elegant Latin presenting Theodoric's government to the Roman world. Another important figure was Boethius, a Roman philosopher and statesman who served Theodoric for many years. Boethius was one of the most learned men of his age, a translator of Greek philosophy and an original thinker in his own right. He held high office under Theodoric and seemed destined for even greater things. His fate, which we will discuss shortly, reveals the darker side of Theodoric's reign. Theodoric was a great builder. He constructed new buildings throughout Italy and restored old ones that had fallen into disrepair. In Ravenna, his capital, he built a magnificent palace and a great church, now known as Sant'Apollinare Nuovo. He built his own mausoleum, a massive circular structure that still stands today. He repaired aqueducts, walls and public buildings in Rome and other cities. The arts flourished under Theodoric's patronage. Mosaic artists created stunning works that decorated churches and palaces. Metal workers produced elaborate jewellery and church furnishings. Scribes copied manuscripts, preserving classical literature for future generations. Theodoric's court attracted scholars and artists from throughout the Mediterranean world. Theodoric also worked to maintain peace with his neighbours. He married his daughters to the kings of the Visigoths, the Vandals and the Burgundians, creating a network of alliances that spanned the barbarian kingdoms. He intervened in Visigothic affairs after the disaster at Fouillé, serving as regent for his grandson Amalaric and helping to stabilise the Visigothic kingdom after its loss of Gaul. For a time, Theodoric was the most powerful ruler in the West, a king whose influence stretched from Spain to the Balkans. Theodoric's foreign policy was built on the idea of balance. He sought to prevent any single power from dominating the West. When the Franks grew too strong, he supported their enemies. When the Eastern Empire threatened, he built alliances against it. He corresponded with rulers throughout the known world, from the emperor in Constantinople to the kings of the distant Scandinavian lands. His letters, preserved by Cassiodorus, reveal a sophisticated diplomat who understood the complexities of international relations. The relationship with the Eastern Empire was particularly delicate. Theodoric ruled Italy in the emperor's name, at least in theory. He acknowledged imperial supremacy and used titles that the emperor had granted him. But in practice, he was an independent ruler who made his own decisions without consulting Constantinople. This ambiguity suited both sides for many years. The emperor could claim that Italy was still part of the empire. Theodoric could rule without interference. Religious differences complicated this relationship. Theodoric and his Goths were Arian Christians, while the emperor and most of his subjects were Catholic. The theological dispute between Arianism and Catholicism had been raging for centuries. It concerned the nature of Christ and his relationship to God the Father. To modern ears, the differences might seem subtle, but to people of the time, they were matters of eternal salvation or damnation. Theodoric generally pursued a policy of religious tolerance. He allowed Catholics to worship freely and did not interfere with the Catholic Church. He even intervened to protect Jews from mob violence, declaring that he could not command religion because no one could be forced to believe against their will. This tolerance was remarkable for its time and helped maintain peace between Goths and Romans. But tensions simmered beneath the surface. The Catholic clergy never fully accepted Arian rule. They looked to Constantinople for support and hoped for eventual liberation from heretical governance. The emperor, for his part, saw the religious division as a tool for influence. He could appeal to Catholic loyalty against the Arian Goths whenever it suited his purposes. In the 520s, these tensions erupted into crisis. The Emperor Justin and his nephew and successor Justinian began persecuting Arians within the Eastern Empire. They closed Arian churches and forced Arians to convert to Catholicism. Theodoric was outraged. He saw this as an attack on his people and his faith. He demanded that the Pope intercede with the Emperor to stop the persecution. The Pope at this time was John I. He travelled to Constantinople on Theodoric's behalf, the first pope ever to visit the eastern capital. The mission was a diplomatic success in some ways. The emperor received the pope with great honours and made some concessions on the Arian question. But Theodoric was not satisfied. He suspected that the pope had not pressed hard enough, that he had secretly sympathised with the emperor against the Goths. When Pope John returned to Italy, Theodoric had him arrested and imprisoned. The pope died in custody, probably from the harsh conditions of his confinement. The Catholic Church later declared him a martyr, a victim of Arian persecution. The incident revealed the deep mistrust between Goths and Romans that had always lurked beneath the surface of Theodoric's kingdom. Even more dramatic was the fall of Boethius. This Roman philosopher and statesman had served Theodoric faithfully for years. He had held the highest offices in the kingdom and seemed to enjoy the king's complete trust. But in 523, Boethius was accused of treason. He was charged with conspiring with the Eastern Empire against Theodoric, with practicing magic, and with other crimes. The charges were probably false, the result of court intrigue and the jealousy of rivals. But Theodoric believed them, or at least acted as if he did. Boethius was arrested, imprisoned, and eventually executed. During his imprisonment, he wrote his most famous work, The Consolation of Philosophy. This book, a meditation on fate, fortune, and the nature of happiness, became one of the most influential works of the Middle Ages. The execution of Boethius revealed a darker side of Theodoric. The tolerant, enlightened ruler of earlier years had become suspicious and cruel. He saw conspiracies everywhere. He trusted no one. The harmony between Goths and Romans that he had worked so hard to create was breaking down. The dream of a united Gothic Roman kingdom was fading. Theodoric died in 526, just a few years after these events. He was about 72 years old, ancient by the standards of the time. He had ruled Italy for 33 years and had accomplished much. He had given his people a homeland. He had preserved Roman civilization in Italy. He had maintained peace in a violent world. But his final years were clouded by suspicion and bloodshed. Theodoric was buried in the great mausoleum he had built for himself in Ravenna. This structure still stands today, a massive circular building topped by a single, enormous stone that weighs hundreds of tons. How the Ostrogoths moved this stone into place remains a mystery. The mausoleum is a fitting monument to a remarkable ruler, impressive and enigmatic. The succession after Theodoric's death was troubled. His only son had died young, so the throne passed to his grandson Athalaric, who was only 10 years old. Athalaric's mother, Amalasuntha, served as regent, ruling in her son's name. Amalasuntha was an educated woman who admired Roman culture and wanted to give her son a Roman education. But the Gothic nobles objected. They wanted Athalaric raised as a Gothic warrior, not a Roman scholar. Amalasuntha was forced to compromise, allowing Athalaric to be educated by Gothic nobles. The result was disastrous. The young king fell in with rough companions who encouraged him to drink and carouse. His health deteriorated rapidly. He died in 534, still a teenager, worn out by excess. Amalasuntha was left without an heir and without support. Amalasuntha tried to maintain her position by marrying her cousin Theodahad and making him co-ruler. This was a fatal mistake. Theodahad was ambitious and treacherous. He quickly turned against Amalasuntha, having her arrested and imprisoned on an island. Shortly afterward, she was murdered, strangled in her bath by relatives of people she had earlier condemned to death. The murder of Amalasuntha gave the Eastern Emperor Justinian the excuse he needed to intervene in Italy. Justinian was one of the most ambitious rulers in Roman history. He dreamed of restoring the Roman Empire to its former glory, reconquering the territories that had been lost to the barbarians. He had already conquered the Vandal kingdom in North Africa. Now he turned his attention to Italy. The wars that followed would devastate Italy and ultimately destroy the Ostrogothic kingdom. These conflicts, known as the Gothic Wars, lasted for nearly 20 years, from 535 to 554. They were among the most destructive wars in Italian history, reducing the peninsula to ruin and ending the prosperity that Theodoric had built. Justinian's general for the Italian campaign was Belisarius, one of the greatest military commanders of the ancient world. Belisarius had already conquered the Vandal kingdom with a small army, demonstrating his tactical genius. He was loyal, capable, and ruthless. He was exactly the man Justinian needed for the difficult task ahead. Belisarius landed in Sicily in 535 with a relatively small force, perhaps only 7,000 men. The Ostrogoths were caught off guard. They had expected an attack, but not so soon, and not in such strength. Sicily fell quickly, and Belisarius crossed to the Italian mainland. He advanced up the peninsula, taking city after city. Naples fell after a siege. Rome itself opened its gates without a fight. The Gothic king Theodahad proved utterly incompetent. He had no military experience and no talent for leadership. He tried to negotiate with Justinian, offering to surrender the kingdom in exchange for a comfortable retirement. When these negotiations became known, the Gothic nobles were outraged. They deposed Theodahad and elected a new king, a warrior named Vitiges. Vitiges was a capable soldier, but faced an almost impossible situation. The Goths were scattered across Italy, while Belisarius held Rome and controlled the south. Vitiges gathered what forces he could and marched on Rome, determined to recapture the ancient capital. The siege of Rome that followed was one of the epic struggles of the age. The siege began in March 537 and lasted for over a year. Vitiges had perhaps 50,000 men, a huge army by the standards of the time. Belisarius had only about 5,000, a tiny garrison for a city the size of Rome. But Belisarius was a master of defensive warfare. He used the ancient walls of Rome, strengthened them where necessary, and employed every trick he knew to hold off the Gothic assault. The Goths attacked again and again, but they could not break through. Belisarius launched counterattacks that inflicted heavy casualties. He cut the aqueducts that supplied the Gothic camp with water. He harassed their supply lines and ambushed their foraging parties. The siege became a war of attrition that the Goths could not win. Disease swept through the Gothic camp. Food became scarce. Morale plummeted. After more than a year, Vitiges was forced to withdraw. He had lost tens of thousands of men and had nothing to show for it. Rome remained in Roman hands. The prestige of the Gothic kingdom was shattered. Belisarius followed up his success with a campaign in northern Italy. He captured Ravenna, the Gothic capital, in 540. Vitiges himself was taken prisoner and sent to Constantinople, where he lived out his days in comfortable captivity. The Gothic kingdom seemed finished. Belisarius had conquered Italy in just 5 years with a tiny army. It was one of the most remarkable military achievements in history, but the conquest was not complete. Many Goths refused to accept defeat. They retreated to the fortresses of northern Italy and continued to resist. They elected new kings and fought on. The war that Justinian thought was over was actually just beginning. Belisarius was recalled to Constantinople, partly because Justinian was jealous of his success and partly because he was needed elsewhere. The generals who replaced him were less capable. The Roman forces in Italy were too small to control the entire peninsula. The Goths began to recover. The man who led the Gothic recovery was Totila, one of the most remarkable figures of the age. Totila was young, energetic, and charismatic. He was elected king in 541 and immediately set about rebuilding Gothic power. He was a brilliant commander who understood that he could not defeat the Romans in pitched battle. Instead, he waged a war of maneuver and attrition, wearing down the enemy through constant pressure. Totila won over the Italian population by treating them well. He reduced taxes and protected peasants from exploitation. He welcomed slaves and deserters into his army, offering them freedom and a share of the plunder. He presented himself not as a barbarian conqueror, but as a liberator, freeing Italy from the oppression of corrupt Roman officials. The Roman position in Italy collapsed with astonishing speed. City after city fell to Totila. Naples was captured. Rome itself was taken in 546, just 6 years after Belisarius had triumphantly entered it. The population of Rome, which had already declined dramatically, fell even further. The great city that had once held 1 million people was reduced to a few thousand inhabitants, huddling among the ruins. Justinian sent Belisarius back to Italy, but this time the great general lacked the resources he needed. The emperor provided only a handful of troops and little money. Belisarius did what he could, recapturing Rome briefly, but he could not turn the tide. He was recalled again in 549, having accomplished little. The Gothic kingdom under Totila was stronger than ever. Totila's success forced Justinian to make a maximum efforts. He assembled a new army, larger and better equipped than any he had sent before. He appointed a new commander, an elderly eunuch named Narses. Narses was an unlikely choice for a military leader, but he proved to be exactly what the situation required. He was an excellent organizer, a careful planner, and a competent tactician. Narses invaded Italy in 552 with an army of perhaps 30,000 men. This was the largest Roman force to enter Italy in generations. It included not just Roman troops, but also contingents of barbarian allies, including Lombards, Heralds, and even some Huns. Narses marched down the peninsula, seeking a decisive battle with Totila. The two armies met at Taginae in central Italy in June or July 552. Totila had perhaps 15,000 men, half the size of Narses's army. But the Gothic king was confident. He had won victory after victory over the past decade. He believed that Gothic courage and skill would overcome Roman numbers. The Battle of Taginae was the decisive engagement of the Gothic wars. Narses deployed his army carefully, with infantry in the centre and archers on the flanks. When the Gothic cavalry charged, they were met with a hail of arrows that decimated their ranks. The survivors crashed into the Roman infantry line, but could not break through. The Gothic infantry came up in support, but was also repulsed. As the battle turned against them, the Goths began to flee. Totila himself was wounded, struck by an arrow or a lance. He was carried from the field by his bodyguards, but died of his wounds shortly afterward. The Gothic army was destroyed. Thousands were killed in the battle and the pursuit that followed. The kingdom that Totila had rebuilt was shattered once again, but still the Goths fought on. They elected a new king, Teia, and gathered what forces remained. Teia led his army south, hoping to join with a Gothic garrison that still held out in Campania. Narses pursued him and brought him to battle at Mons Lactarius, near Mount Vesuvius, in October 552. The Battle of Mons Lactarius was the last stand of the Ostrogothic kingdom. The Goths fought with desperate courage, knowing that defeat meant the end of their nation. Teia himself fought in the front ranks, performing prodigies of valour. When his shield became too heavy, with embedded javelins, he would call for a fresh one and continue fighting. He killed many Romans with his own hand before he finally fell. The battle lasted 2 days. On the second day, the Goths finally broke. Plataea was dead, and there was no one left to lead them. The survivors surrendered or fled. Some escaped to the north, where they held out for a few more years. But the Ostrogothic kingdom was finished. The last significant resistance ended in 554, when Narses defeated a combined force of Goths and Franks at Catilinum. The Gothic wars were over, but Italy was ruined. 20 years of warfare had devastated the peninsula. Cities had been sacked and burned. The countryside had been ravaged. The population had plummeted. Rome itself was a shadow of its former self. Its aqueducts cut, its buildings crumbling, its people scattered. The prosperity that Theodoric had built was gone forever. The Ostrogoths, as a people, simply disappeared. Those who survived the wars were absorbed into the Italian population or fled to other lands. Their language died out. Their customs were forgotten. Within a few generations, it was as if they had never existed. Only their buildings and their artifacts remained as testimony to their brief moment of glory. Justinian had achieved his goal of reconquering Italy, but the victory was hollow. The Italy he recovered was impoverished and depopulated. It could not be held for long. Just 14 years after the end of the Gothic Wars, a new barbarian people invaded Italy. These were the Lombards, who would conquer much of the peninsula and establish a kingdom that lasted for 2 centuries. The Gothic Wars marked the true end of the ancient world in Italy. The Roman civilization that had survived under Gothic rule was finally destroyed by Roman reconquest. The great cities of antiquity fell into ruin. The sophisticated economy of the Roman world collapsed. Italy entered the Dark Ages, a period of poverty and fragmentation from which it would not fully emerge for centuries. While the Ostrogoths were fighting and dying in Italy, their Visigothic cousins in Spain were enjoying a period of relative peace and prosperity. The Visigothic kingdom had survived the loss of Gaul and had consolidated its control over the Iberian Peninsula, but the Visigoths too would eventually fall, conquered by a new and unexpected enemy. We have already traced the history of the Visigothic kingdom through the 6th century, from the disaster at Vouailles to the conversion to Catholicism under King Recared. Now let us examine the final century of Visigothic rule, from the early 7th century to the Muslim conquest in 711. The 7th century began promisingly for the Visigothic kingdom. King Recared's conversion had ended the religious divide between Goths and Romans. The kingdom was united as never before. The economy was stable and culture flourished. The great scholar Isidore of Seville was producing his encyclopedic works. The church councils at Toledo were developing a sophisticated system of governance that combined royal and ecclesiastical authority. King Sisebut, who reigned from 612 to 621, was one of the more notable rulers of this period. He was a learned man who wrote poetry and corresponded with Isidore of Seville. He was also a capable military commander who waged successful campaigns against the Byzantine enclaves in southern Spain. Under Sisebut, the Visigoths conquered most of the remaining Byzantine territory, leaving only a small strip of coastline in imperial hands. But Sisebut's reign also saw the beginning of a troubling policy, the persecution of Jews. The Jews had lived in Spain since Roman times, forming a prosperous community engaged in trade and crafts. They had generally been tolerated under earlier Visigothic kings, even protected by rulers like Theodoric the Great. But Sisebut issued decrees forcing Jews to convert to Christianity or face exile. This policy of persecution would continue under later kings, with varying degrees of intensity. Some rulers enforced the anti-Jewish laws strictly, while others allowed them to lapse. But the overall trend was toward increasing pressure on the Jewish community. Jews who converted were often suspected of practicing their old faith in secret. They were subjected to special restrictions and surveillance. This created a disaffected minority within the kingdom, a group with little loyalty to their Visigothic rulers. The political history of the 7th century Visigothic kingdom was marked by instability at the top. The Visigoths had never fully accepted the principle of hereditary succession. In theory, the king was elected by the nobles and the bishops. In practice, kings tried to pass the throne to their sons, but they were not always successful. Disputed successions led to civil wars, assassinations and coups. King Chindaswintha, who reigned from 642 to 653, tried to solve this problem through terror. He executed hundreds of nobles who might challenge his rule and confiscated their property. He forced the church councils to declare that anyone who plotted against the king would be excommunicated and damned. He succeeded in passing the throne to his son Rekiswintha, but the underlying tensions remained. Rekiswintha is remembered primarily for his legal reforms. He issued the Liber Judiciorum, the comprehensive law code that applied to all inhabitants of the kingdom, regardless of their ethnic origin. This code marked the end of the separate legal systems for Goths and Romans. It was a milestone in the fusion of the two peoples into a single Visigothic nation. The Liber Judiciorum was a remarkable achievement, one of the most sophisticated legal codes of the early medieval period. It covered criminal law, civil law, family law, and property law. It established procedures for trials and set penalties for various offences. It was systematic, comprehensive, and relatively humane. It would influence Spanish law for centuries after the Visigothic kingdom itself had fallen, but legal reform could not solve the fundamental problems of the Visigothic kingdom. The nobility remained powerful and ambitious. They controlled vast estates and commanded private armies. They resented royal attempts to limit their power. They were always ready to support a rival claimant to the throne if it served their interests. The church was another centre of power that sometimes cooperated with the kings and sometimes opposed them. The bishops were great landowners in their own right, and they controlled the church councils that played such an important role in Visigothic governance. They could legitimate a king or undermine him. They were essential allies, but also potential rivals. King Wamba, who reigned from 672 to 680, was one of the more capable later Visigothic rulers. He came to power reluctantly, elected by the nobles after the previous king died without an heir. He proved to be an energetic ruler who strengthened the army and suppressed rebellions. He even campaigned across the Pyrenees, reasserting Visigothic authority over Septimania, the strip of southern Gaul that the Visigoths still held. But Wamba fell victim to a palace coup. He was drugged and given a penitential haircut and robe, symbols that indicated he had renounced the world and could no longer serve as king. When he recovered from the drugging, he found that he had been legally deposed. He retired to a monastery and lived out his days in obscurity. The nobles had shown that no king was safe from their intrigues. The last decades of the Visigothic kingdom were marked by increasing chaos. Kings rose and fell with alarming frequency. Civil wars broke out repeatedly. The nobles pursued their own interests with little regard for the kingdom as a whole. The army weakened as resources were diverted to internal conflicts. The kingdom was tearing itself apart. The final crisis began in 710, with the death of King Wititza. Wititza had tried to secure the succession for his sons, but a faction of nobles opposed them. This faction elected a nobleman named Roderick as king. Wititza's sons and their supporters refused to accept this result. The kingdom was split between two rival factions, each claiming legitimacy. What happened next is shrouded in legend and controversy. According to later accounts, the sons of Wititza, or perhaps a nobleman named Julian, who had a personal grievance against Roderick, invited the Muslims of North Africa to intervene. They hoped to use Muslim military power to defeat Roderick and seize the throne for themselves. It was a catastrophically foolish decision. The Muslims who crossed into Spain in 711 were not mercenaries who could be used and dismissed. They were warriors of a dynamic new faith that had already conquered much of the Middle East and North Africa. They were led by capable commanders who saw Spain as the next target for expansion. They came not to help one Visigothic faction against another, but to conquer the entire peninsula for Islam. The Muslim commander was Tariq ibn Ziyad, a Berber general serving the Arab Caliphate. He crossed the Straits of Gibraltar with an army of perhaps 7,000 men. The rock where he landed still bears his name, Jabal Tariq, the mountain of Tariq, which we know as Gibraltar. From this landing point, Tariq advanced into the heart of Visigothic Spain. King Roderick gathered what forces he could and marched to meet the invaders. The two armies clashed at the Battle of Guadalete, near the mouth of the Guadalete River in southern Spain. The exact date is uncertain, but it was probably in July 711. The battle would decide the fate of the Visigothic kingdom. The details of the Battle of Guadalete are poorly documented. Later sources, written centuries after the event, provide dramatic accounts that may or may not be accurate. What is clear is that the battle was a catastrophic defeat for the Visigoths. King Roderick was killed, though his body was never found. The Visigothic army was destroyed. The kingdom lost its king, its army, and any hope of organised resistance. Some sources claim that treachery played a role in the Visigothic defeat. According to these accounts, the sons of Wititza, or their supporters, abandoned Roderick during the battle, switching sides or simply withdrawing from the field. Whether this is true or a later attempt to explain an otherwise inexplicable disaster, we cannot know for certain. After Guadalete, the Muslim conquest proceeded with astonishing speed. City after city fell with little resistance. Toledo, the Visigothic capital, was captured without a fight. Córdoba, Seville and Mérida followed in quick succession. Within just a few years, almost the entire Iberian Peninsula was in Muslim hands. The speed of the conquest suggests that the Visigothic kingdom was already fatally weakened before the Muslims arrived. The civil wars had exhausted the kingdom's military resources. The nobility was divided and demoralized. The common people had little loyalty to their Gothic rulers. The Jews, persecuted for generations, may have welcomed the Muslim conquerors as liberators. The kingdom collapsed from within, as much as it was conquered from without. Only in the mountainous north did Christian resistance survive. A Visigothic nobleman named Pelayo established a small kingdom in Asturias, in the mountains of northwestern Spain. According to legend, Pelayo won a victory over a Muslim force at Covadonga in 722, the first Christian victory of the Reconquista. From this tiny beginning would eventually emerge the Christian kingdoms that would reconquer Spain over the following 8 centuries. The fall of the Visigothic kingdom marks the end of 3 centuries of Gothic rule in Spain. The Visigoths had come as conquerors and had built a sophisticated kingdom on the ruins of Roman Spain. They had converted to Catholicism and had fused with the Roman population to create a new Visigothic identity. They had produced scholars, artists, and lawmakers. And then they were gone, swept away by the tide of Islamic conquest. But the legacy of the Visigoths did not disappear entirely. The Christian kingdoms of northern Spain claimed to be the heirs of the Visigothic kingdom. They preserved Visigothic law and Visigothic traditions. They saw themselves as continuing the Visigothic mission of ruling a Christian Spain. The Reconquista was, in a sense, a Visigothic project, an attempt to restore what the Muslims had taken. The Liber Judiciorum remained in use in Christian Spain for centuries after the Muslim conquest. It was translated into Spanish and continued to serve as the basis for legal proceedings. Elements of Visigothic law can still be traced in later Spanish legal codes. The Visigoths may have vanished as a people, but their legal legacy endured. Visigothic art and architecture also left lasting traces. The horseshoe arch, which the Visigoths used in their churches, was adopted by the Muslims and became a characteristic feature of Islamic architecture in Spain. When the Christians reconquered Spain, they incorporated Visigothic and Islamic elements into their own buildings, creating the distinctive style known as Mozarabic. The visual legacy of the Visigoths thus persisted through multiple cultural transformations. The memory of the Visigoths remained important in Spanish identity for centuries. Spanish kings claimed descent from Visigothic rulers. Spanish historians celebrated Visigothic achievements. The idea of Spain as a unified Christian kingdom, which the Visigoths had first realized, remained a powerful ideal throughout the Middle Ages and beyond. In this sense, the Visigothic kingdom never entirely ended. It was transformed into something new, but its influence persisted.